My own son left me to die in a foreign country after I wired him $68,000 to save his life. I stood in the suffocating heat of a dirt-floor airport terminal, stripped of my passport, my phone, and my dignity, believing his disappearance was a tragic mistake. But when I finally managed to reach his wife back in the States, her panicked whisper revealed a truth that froze the blood in my veins. He did not lose me. He erased me. And he was already back home, stepping over my ghost to steal the multi-million-dollar empire I spent 40 years pulling copper wire to build. My name is Thomas Caldwell, but everyone who knows me calls me Tommy. I am 68 years old. For 40 years I worked as a master electrician. I started out with nothing but a pair of wire strippers, a rusted-out cargo van, and a work ethic that kept me out of bed before the sun even thought about rising. I built Caldwell Commercial Contracting from the ground up. I spent decades breathing in drywall dust, crawling through blistering hot attics, and risking my life on high-voltage panels just to make sure my family never had to know the kind of poverty I grew up in. I thought I knew how to build a solid foundation. I thought I knew how to ground a circuit to keep a house safe from a surge. But nothing could have prepared me for the complete and total shock of what my own flesh and blood did to me. The Costa Rican heat is relentless. It presses down on you like a wet woolen blanket. I was standing in the middle of a tiny rural airport terminal miles away from the main tourist hubs. The air conditioning was broken. The ceiling fans barely pushed the heavy, humid air around. Flies buzzed near the open doors. I was sweating through my shirt, my knees aching from standing on the cracked tile floor. I had been waiting for my son Brent. He is 34 years old, a young man who I gave everything to. Private schools, a college degree paid in full, a shiny car for his graduation. I gave him the soft life. And maybe that was my first and greatest mistake. Just an hour earlier, Brent had pulled our rental car up to the curb outside the terminal. He turned to me with that easy, polished smile of his. He said, "Dad, you wait right here with your carry-on. I need to pull the rental car around to the long-term lot and return the keys. Give me your wallet and your phone so I can pay the exit fee and download our digital boarding passes from the kiosk. It will just take a second." I did not hesitate. Why would I? He was my son. I handed him my leather wallet containing my identification, my credit cards, and all my cash. I handed him my smartphone. My passport was already in the glove compartment of the car, tucked inside a travel pouch Brent had offered to carry for safekeeping. I stepped out of the car, closed the door, and watched him drive around the corner toward the parking garage. That was the last time I saw him. The first hour passed slowly. I figured there was a line at the rental return. I found a hard wooden bench near the departure gate and sat down. I watched the local families saying goodbye to each other. I watched the baggage handlers tossing suitcases onto carts. The terminal was small, chaotic, and loud. By the second hour, a small knot of worry began to form in my stomach. I got up and walked to the automatic doors, peering out into the blinding tropical sunlight. There was no sign of Brent. No sign of the white rental car. I tried to reason with myself. I am a man of logic. When a commercial building loses power, you do not panic. You trace the lines. You check the breakers. You find the fault. I told myself he probably had an issue with the paperwork. Maybe the car had a scratch and they were arguing over the deposit. But as the third hour bled into the fourth, the logic began to fail. The knot in my stomach twisted into a sharp physical pain. The heat inside the terminal was becoming unbearable. I felt the sweat dripping down my temples, stinging my eyes. I walked out to the parking lot, ignoring the burning sun. I scoured every row of cars. The lot was small. It took me less than 15 minutes to check every single vehicle. Our rental car was not there. I walked back inside, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through wet concrete. I approached the ticket counter. The woman behind the glass spoke very little English, and my Spanish was limited to a handful of words. I tried to ask about a flight back to Atlanta. I tried to ask if a Brent Caldwell had checked in. She typed on her keyboard, shook her head, and said something I could not understand. She pointed to the departure board. There were no more flights to the United States that day. Hour 5 arrived like a suffocating weight. The terminal began to empty out. The small shops were pulling down their metal security grills. The echo of rolling suitcases faded away, leaving only the buzzing of a faulty fluorescent light fixture above my head. That buzzing sound mocked me, a lifetime of fixing electrical faults, and here I was completely powerless. The realization began to hit me in physical waves. My heart started racing, hammering against my ribs so violently I thought I was having a heart attack. My throat tightened until swallowing felt like swallowing broken glass. My vision blurred the edges of the room, turning dark. I was not lost. I had been intentionally stranded. My own son had driven away and left me here. He took my money. He took my communication. He took my identity. He took my ability to leave. I sat back down on the bench, gripping the wooden edges with trembling fingers. I tried to force air into my lungs. Why? Why would he do this? The memory of how we ended up in this foreign country slammed into my mind, bringing a wave of nausea. 72 hours ago, I was sitting in my comfortable kitchen back in Georgia. I was enjoying my retirement, drinking black coffee and reading the morning paper. Brent burst through my front door, looking like a hunted animal. He was shaking, pale, and completely frantic. He collapsed into a kitchen chair and buried his face in his hands. He told me a story that terrified me. He said his new technology startup had failed. He said he had taken out loans to keep it afloat, but not from a bank. He had borrowed money from private, dangerous lenders, vicious men who did not care about contracts, only about collecting what was owed. "Dad, they are going to hurt me," he had sobbed, the tears streaming down his face. "I need $68,000. I need it by tomorrow or I am dead. I am a father. You see your child in danger, you do not stop to interrogate them. You protect them. That is the job." I had spent 40 years building my wealth. I had millions sitting safely in investment accounts and liquid assets. $68,000 was a fraction of what I had, but to my son it was life or death. I drove him to the bank that very morning. I authorized a direct wire transfer to the account he provided. I paid his debt. I saved his life. Or so I thought. The relief on his face had seemed so genuine. He hugged me tightly. He thanked me over and over. Then he offered the bait. He said he had a lead on a massive commercial real estate foreclosure in Costa Rica. He said it was a prime investment opportunity, a chance to flip a resort property and make back the money he owed me tenfold. He begged me to fly down with him just for 2 days to inspect the electrical grid on the property before he made a bid. It was the perfect excuse. He knew I could not resist a commercial walkthrough. He knew I missed the thrill of inspecting a site. He knew exactly what buttons to push to get me on that airplane. Now, sitting in the sweltering heat of the abandoned terminal, the pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity. There was no real estate deal. There was no resort property. The entire trip was a meticulously staged illusion to get me out of the United States. To get me to a place where I did not speak the language, where I had no friends, no resources, and no way back. But why? Was the $68,000 not enough? Why strand me here? The panic was clawing at my chest. I had to do something. I could not just sit here and disappear. I stood up, my knees popping. The terminal was almost completely deserted. In the far corner near the restrooms, I saw a small concession stand that was still open. An older woman with kind, tired eyes was wiping down the counter with a damp rag. Behind her, mounted on the chipped plaster wall, was a heavy black telephone. I walked toward her. Every step felt like a marathon. I reached the counter and leaned against it, trying to keep my hands from shaking visibly. She looked at me, seeing the sweat, the pale skin, the sheer desperation in my eyes. "Please," I croaked, my voice cracking dryly. "Phone. I need to use the phone." I patted my empty pockets to show her I had no money. I had nothing. Then I looked down at my left wrist. I was wearing a heavy silver watch. It was a retirement gift from my lead foreman engraved on the back. It meant the world to me, but my life meant more. I unclasped the watch and slid it across the counter toward her. I pointed to the phone again. "Please, my son. I need to call my son." The woman looked at the watch, then looked up at my face. A look of deep pity crossed her features. She pushed the watch back toward me, shaking her head. She gestured toward the phone on the wall and nodded. I nearly collapsed with gratitude. I picked up the heavy receiver. My fingers were trembling so violently I could barely press the buttons. I dialed the international exit code, then the country code, and then Brent's cell phone number. I knew it by heart. I had paid the bill for that number since he was a teenager. I pressed the receiver to my ear and closed my eyes, praying to a God I had not spoken to in a long time. Please let this be a mistake. Let him answer. Let him say he got a flat tire, that he got delayed by the local police, anything. Any excuse at all. I would forgive him. Just answer the phone. The line clicked. It hummed with the distant routing of international satellites, and then a voice came on the line. It was not Brent. It was not a ringtone. It was an automated robotic voice speaking in cold, calculated English. "The number you have dialed is disconnected or no longer in service." The words echoed in my ear. Disconnected. No longer in service. I stood there in the stifling heat, the receiver pressed tight against my face. The automated message repeated itself, hammering the final nail into the coffin of my denial. Brent had not lost his phone. He had not run out of battery. He had planned this so thoroughly that he had completely terminated his mobile service the moment he walked out of those sliding doors. The receiver slipped from my trembling fingers and dangled from its metal cord, swinging gently against the wall. The buzzing of the broken light fixture above me seemed to grow louder, filling my head, until it was the only sound left in the world. I was 68 years old. I had built a multi-million-dollar empire with my bare hands. I had provided everything a father could possibly provide, and my reward was to be erased. Left to rot in a foreign country by the boy who carried my name. I did not know it yet, but the absolute worst was still to come. I did not yet know what that $68,000 had actually been used for. I did not know the staggering scale of the betrayal waiting for me back home. But as I stood alone in that dark, sweltering terminal, I made a silent vow. I was not going to die here. I am a master electrician. When someone cuts the power, you do not sit in the dark and wait to die. You find a way to wire around the damage. You find a way to turn the lights back on. And when I finally flipped the switch on Brent's massive lie, I was going to make sure the surge burned his entire stolen life to the ground. I let the heavy plastic receiver slip from my trembling fingers. It dropped and swung from its metal cord, clattering loudly against the chipped tile wall. The dead, disconnected tone buzzed in my ears long after the line had gone silent. My mind was reeling backward, dragged forcefully out of the suffocating tropical heat of this Costa Rican airport, and thrown directly into the cool, quiet comfort of my own kitchen in Georgia. It was only 3 days ago. 72 hours. That is all it took to completely dismantle a lifetime of blind trust and unconditional love. It was a Tuesday morning. I was standing at the granite island in my kitchen, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The morning sun was pouring through the large bay windows I had installed myself. The house was perfectly quiet. It was a safe haven built on 4 decades of manual labor, early mornings and late nights. Then the heavy oak front door flew open with a violent crash. Brent stumbled into the foyer. He looked like a man running from a firing squad. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained. His silk tie was pulled loose and hanging sideways. His hair, usually slicked and perfect, stuck to his forehead with nervous sweat. He collapsed onto one of the kitchen bar stools and buried his face in his manicured hands. His shoulders heaved. He began to sob. He cried with loud, gasping breaths that tore right through my chest. I put my coffee down so fast the dark liquid spilled across the granite counter. I rushed over to him. I put my heavy, calloused hands on his shaking shoulders. I asked him what was wrong. I demanded to know who was chasing him. He looked up at me with red, terrified eyes. He played the part flawlessly. He told me his technology startup had completely collapsed. The venture capital had dried up overnight. The investors had pulled out without warning. But the business failing was not the real emergency. He claimed he had taken out desperate bridge loans to cover the payroll and keep the servers running. He did not go to a bank. He did not go to a legitimate lending firm. He said he went to shadow lenders. Private moneymen who operated out of back rooms and did not care about standard collection laws. Men who broke bones and threatened families when payments were missed. He owed them exactly $68,000. The deadline was the next morning. If he did not have the cash wired to their offshore accounts, he said they promised to put him in a hospital, or worse. He grabbed the fabric of my shirt and begged me to save his life. I am a retired master electrician. Most people look at a man in worn denim jeans and steel-toe boots and assume he is just scraping by on a modest pension. They do not understand the kind of silent wealth you can build if you know how to run a business and refuse to waste money on flashy things. For 40 years, I pulled heavy-gauge copper wire through freezing commercial buildings. I breathed in toxic drywall dust. I crawled through dark, sweltering attics until my knees bled and my back screamed in agony. Every drop of sweat, every bruised knuckle, every skipped weekend was turned into secure investments. I built Caldwell Commercial Contracting into a multi-million-dollar firm, and I lived like a man making minimum wage. I had more than enough liquid capital sitting quietly in secure accounts. $68,000 is a massive sum of money. For a man who respects the value of a hard-earned dollar, it is a small fortune. But when you are looking at your only child, weeping in absolute terror, the money means absolutely nothing. I did not lecture him. I did not ask to see his corporate accounting ledgers. I did not ask to speak to these dangerous lenders. I saw my child in danger, and my only instinct was to throw myself in front of the bullet. I grabbed my keys and drove him straight to my primary bank branch. I sat across from the branch manager, a man who had handled my accounts for 20 years. I instructed him to initiate an immediate wire transfer to the account Brent provided. I remember the manager looking at me with a hint of professional concern. He asked if I was absolutely certain about moving that much liquid cash in a single rapid transaction. I looked him dead in the eye and told him it was for my son. That was all the justification I needed. I signed the heavy stack of authorization forms. I watched the teller stamp the final receipt. I handed that piece of paper to my son. I wiped away his massive debt in less than an hour. I thought I was being his shield. I thought I was doing exactly what a father is supposed to do. We walked out of the air-conditioned bank and into the bright Georgia sun. Brent wrapped his arms around me in a tight embrace. He squeezed me so tight I could feel his ribs. He told me I was his hero. He swore he would never forget what I had just done for him. And right there in the parking lot, I witnessed a miraculous transformation. The tears stopped completely. The frantic shaking disappeared. His breathing slowed down to a calm, steady rhythm. The terrified, desperate boy vanished, and the smooth-talking corporate salesman returned right before my eyes. He looked at me with a bright, eager energy. He said he already had a guaranteed plan to pay me back every single penny within a month. He pitched me an incredible story. He claimed he had insider knowledge about a massive commercial real estate foreclosure down in Costa Rica. He described an abandoned luxury resort that was being auctioned off for a fraction of its true value. He said an investment group was ready to buy it, flip it, and sell it to a major hospitality chain. He just needed to get in on the ground floor to secure his commission. But there was a catch. He told me the local electrical grid in that region was notoriously unstable. He said he could not risk investing without a professional assessment. He looked at me with total admiration and said he needed the best master electrician he knew. He needed me to walk the property, inspect the main breaker panels, evaluate the high voltage lines, and tell him if the structural wiring of the building was safe. He begged me to fly down with him for just 48 hours, 2 days in a tropical paradise. We would do the inspection together, enjoy a nice dinner, and fly right back home. He played my pride perfectly. He knew I missed the smell of a busy job site. He knew I prided myself on my technical expertise. He knew I could never resist an opportunity to work side by side with him as a respected equal. I agreed without a second thought. I packed a small duffel bag with a few changes of clothes and my basic testing meters. When we got to the airport, he was the picture of a devoted son. He offered to carry my travel documents in his secure leather pouch so I would not have to worry about losing them. I handed over my passport without hesitation. I trusted him with my life. We boarded the plane together, sharing a drink and talking about the future. I thought I was helping my boy build a new empire. I thought we were finally bonding as men. Now the suffocating heat of the Costa Rican terminal wrapped around my neck like a heavy iron chain. The sounds of a foreign language echoing off the dirty tile floors grounded me in a terrifying reality. I stood completely still beside the concession stand, staring blankly at the chipped wall. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a terrifying mechanical precision. There was no real estate deal. There was no foreclosed luxury resort waiting to be inspected. There was no investment group looking to flip a property. There was no violent shadow lender threatening to break his legs. The tears in my kitchen were completely manufactured. The frantic shaking was an award-winning performance. The realization hit me so hard, my knees actually buckled. I had to grip the edge of the wooden counter to keep from collapsing onto the dirty floor. My heart started racing, hammering against my ribs so violently, I thought it might burst. My throat tightened until drawing a breath felt like swallowing broken glass. My vision blurred the edges of the room, turning dark and narrow. The $68,000 I wired that morning was not a rescue fund to save his life. It was the operating budget for my own disposal. He needed me out of the country. He needed me completely isolated in a place where I did not speak the language and had no local connections. He needed my passport safely tucked away in his bag so I could not board a commercial flight back to America. He needed my wallet so I could not rent a hotel room or hire a private car. He needed my cell phone so I could not call my lawyer or the authorities back home. He had orchestrated every single detail with a cold, calculating, sociopathic brilliance. He used my love as a weapon against me. He knew I would never question a plea for help. The son I had spent 40 years breaking my back to protect had laid a trap so devastatingly simple that I walked right into it with a smile on my face. I was not lost. I had been intentionally discarded like a piece of broken machinery, and the money I gave him was the very tool he used to pay for my erasure. The woman behind the concession counter did not speak a single word of English, but she understood the universal language of absolute desperation. When I dropped to my knees in that sweltering airport terminal, clutching my chest and gasping for breath, she came out from behind her rusted cash register. She brought me a lukewarm bottle of bottled water and sat me down on an overturned plastic crate. Through a frantic mix of hand gestures and broken phrases, I made her understand that I had been robbed of everything. I did not have the heart to tell her that the thief was the very boy I had raised. I offered her my heavy silver retirement watch. This time she took it not as payment for the water, but to broker a deal. She picked up a radio and made a rapid phone call. 20 minutes later, a battered yellow taxi pulled up to the curb outside the glass doors. She spoke quickly to the driver, handed him my silver watch, and pointed a finger directly at me. She looked deep into my eyes and said the word embassy with perfect clarity. I nodded my profound thanks to that kind stranger. I climbed into the back seat of the cab and began the long, grueling ride toward the capital city of San Jose. The journey took hours. The roads were rough and violently winding through dense green mountains that felt more like the towering walls of a prison. I stared out the cracked window, watching the unfamiliar tropical landscape blur past. Every massive pothole jolted my aching spine, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the agony currently tearing through my mind. I kept trying to find a logical explanation for what had just happened. I am a man who has spent 40 years running commercial electrical diagnostics. When a massive system fails, there is always a short circuit somewhere. A frayed wire, a blown fuse. I tried to trace the fault in my son. Where did the rot begin? Was it the expensive private schools I paid for? Was it the brand new cars I bought him? Did I make his life so soft and protected that he lost his basic human empathy? The taxi driver finally dropped me off on a busy, sun-baked street directly in front of the United States Embassy. The sight of that flag waving against the bright blue sky nearly brought me to my knees for a second time. It was a symbol of home, of safety, of a world that actually made sense. I approached the heavy security gates with nothing but the sweat-stained clothes on my back. I had no passport. I had no driver license. I had no credit cards to prove who I was. I approached the armed guards and explained that I was an American citizen who had been stripped of his identification and intentionally stranded. The humiliation of that moment burned the back of my throat. I am a man who employed over 100 hard-working people. I ran a multi-million-dollar contracting firm. I negotiated massive municipal contracts with mayors and city planners. Now I was standing on a foreign sidewalk begging young men in tactical uniforms to let me through a metal gate. They patted me down and escorted me into a sterile, heavily air-conditioned waiting room. The freezing air hit my wet shirt and sent violent shivers through my 68-year-old bones. I waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, a young consular officer named David called me into a small private office. He offered me a paper cup of water and a yellow notepad. He asked for my full name and my social security number to verify my identity in their federal system. I gave him the information. I watched his fingers type rapidly across his keyboard. I told him I needed to contact my family back in Georgia immediately. I told him there had been a terrible emergency, and my son and I had been separated at the airport. I was still protecting Brent, even after everything some foolish, stubborn part of my fatherly instinct refused to expose him to the federal government. I told David my phone had been lost in the rental car, and I desperately needed to make an international call to my daughter-in-law. David looked at my gaunt, exhausted face with genuine sympathy. He pushed his heavy desk phone toward me and dialed the international access codes. He told me to take all the time I needed and quietly stepped out of the room, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. I sat alone in that quiet office, staring at the black plastic receiver. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. My fingers felt stiff and clumsy as I pressed the buttons. I did not know Brent's new number if he even had one, but I knew Sarah's number by heart. Sarah was Brent's wife. She was a quiet, intelligent woman. I had always liked her. I had paid for their lavish country club wedding 5 years ago. I listened to the line ring. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3 rings. My stomach twisted into tight, agonizing knots. The line clicked open. "Hello?" Sarah's voice sounded incredibly small and tight. I closed my eyes and let out a long, ragged breath. "Sarah, it is Tommy. It is your father-in-law. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am at the American Embassy in Costa Rica. Brent and I got separated at the airport. He drove off with all my identification and my wallet. I need you to find a way to contact him or get me a plane ticket home." I waited for her to gasp. I waited for her to cry out in sudden shock. I expected her to frantically ask if I was hurt, to apologize for the terrible misunderstanding, to promise she would fix it immediately. Instead, there was a stretch of dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The silence dragged on for so long, I thought the international connection had completely dropped. Then I heard the sound of a door clicking shut. I heard the distinct sound of a heavy brass deadbolt locking. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was not frantic. It was a terrifying, hushed whisper that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. "Tommy!" She breathed, her voice shaking with absolute terror. "Tommy, are you really alive?" The question hit me like a physical blow to the chest. What kind of question was that? I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning stark white. "Of course I am alive, Sarah. What is going on? Where is my son?" I heard her let out a broken, stifled sob. She was crying, but she was trying desperately to keep her voice down. "You cannot call here again, Tommy. You cannot let him know you are alive." The room around me seemed to tilt dangerously. The cold air from the ventilation vent suddenly felt like a walk-in freezer. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" I demanded, my voice rising, despite my intense efforts to stay calm. "Brent left me at a rural airport. He took my passport. Tell me exactly what is happening right now." Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. "Tommy, the $68,000 you wired him. It was not for a business debt. There were no shadow lenders. There was no dangerous private loan. He lied to you." My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. If it was not for a debt, what did I pay for? Her next words dismantled my entire reality brick by brick. "It was a payoff, Tommy. He used your money to pay a network of corrupt local fixers down there. He bought a crooked medical examiner and a fraudulent notary." My mind struggled to process the horrific words she was saying. Fixers. A notary. A medical examiner. Why would my son buy a medical examiner? The answer crashed into me before she even finished her sentence, bringing a wave of nauseating horror. "He did not leave you there to be stranded, Tommy," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure disgust. "He left you there, so you would never come back. He filed the paperwork yesterday. He claimed you suffered a massive fatal heart attack in a remote provincial village. He paid them to falsify a death certificate. He paid them to document that your body had to be cremated immediately due to local health regulations. As far as the United States government and the state of Georgia are concerned, Thomas Caldwell is dead." I sat completely paralyzed in that embassy chair. My breath stopped entirely in my lungs. My own son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders. The boy whose expensive college tuition I paid in cash. The boy I had just handed $68,000 to out of pure, unconditional love. He had orchestrated my execution on paper. But why? I asked, though the word barely made it past my lips. My voice was nothing more than a hollow rasp. Why would he do this to me? Sarah sniffled a sound of absolute despair. For the Empire. Tommy. He wanted it all, and he did not want to wait for you to pass away naturally. He knew you had a $4 million life insurance policy, and he knew that as your sole heir, he would immediately inherit total control of Caldwell Commercial Contracting, the entire $10 million business. He wants to liquidate it. He has been meeting with your corporate rivals behind your back for months. He is planning to sell off everything you spent 40 years building just so he can have the fast cash to fund a luxury lifestyle. The sheer scale of the betrayal was paralyzing. This was not a moment of panic or a bad business decision. This was a methodical, cold-blooded assassination of my life. He had planned every single detail. He had sat in my kitchen looking me directly in the eye, weeping fake tears, knowing exactly what he was going to do to me. He watched me sign that wire transfer, knowing he was using my own hard-earned money to fund my erasure. Sarah's terrified whisper brought me back to the present moment. He did not abandon you by accident, Tommy. He sold you to the ghosts. You have to come back, but you cannot let him know you are alive. If he finds out you are at the embassy, he will use the rest of that bribe money to make sure you never leave that country. He has dangerous people on his payroll down there now. Please, Tommy, you have to be smart. You have to be a ghost. I closed my eyes. A single tear escaped and rolled down my weathered cheek, falling onto the collar of my sweat-stained shirt. It was the last tear I would ever shed for my son. The agonizing sorrow in my chest suddenly hardened, compressing into something incredibly dense, cold, and unbreakable. I thought about the thousands of miles of heavy copper wire I had pulled with my bare hands. I thought about the decades of breathing construction dust, building a fortune to protect my family. Brent thought I was just an old gullible man he could discard in the jungle. He forgot who he was dealing with. He forgot that I spent my entire life learning how to dismantle and rebuild complex systems. He had cut my power, but he failed to realize I knew exactly how to rewire the circuit. I spoke into the receiver, my voice no longer shaking. It was steady, resonant, and entirely stripped of a father's mercy. Do not worry, Sarah. I am coming home. And when I do, I will bring the whole damn structure down on his head. The quiet click of the receiver settling into its cradle echoed in the small embassy office, like a heavy steel door slamming shut. I sat completely frozen in the utilitarian chair, staring blindly at the dark plastic phone. The chilling, hushed whisper of my daughter-in-law continued to loop through my mind, playing over and over again on a continuous, agonizing cycle. He sold you to the ghosts. My own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of my strength, had used my unconditional love as the down payment for my execution. David, the young consular officer, quietly opened the wooden door and stepped back into the room. He took one look at my ashen face, my trembling hands, and my hollow eyes. He instantly knew the situation had spiraled far beyond a simple case of a misplaced passport or a negligent travel companion. He pulled his chair out and sat across from his metal desk, leaning forward with a look of deep professional concern. I had to explain my horrific predicament to this young government official without sounding like a raving paranoid lunatic. I took a slow, agonizing breath, forcing the air deep into my lungs to steady my racing heart. I laid out the absolute facts in a low, measured voice. I told him my identity had been stolen, my corporate assets were actively being seized, and the architect of this monstrous betrayal was my own flesh and blood. I explained to David the fragile, highly dangerous nature of my current reality. I could not simply log into a public computer, access my domestic bank accounts, and transfer funds to buy a commercial plane ticket home. Brent was a meticulous calculating planner. If he had gone to the unbelievable extreme of bribing foreign fixers to fabricate a legal death certificate, he had undoubtedly placed monitoring software on my personal and business accounts back in Georgia. If a sudden international transaction flagged my credit cards or pulled from my checking reserves, Brent would receive an immediate digital alert. He would know his $68,000 bribe had failed. He would realize the ghost he had carefully buried in a foreign system was actively trying to find a way out of the grave. David listened with remarkable stoicism, but I could clearly see the human empathy working behind his steady gaze. He asked if we should involve the local Costa Rican police to report the theft and the fraud. I immediately shook my head. I explained what Sarah had warned me about on the phone. Brent had used my money to purchase a network of corrupt officials, fraudulent notaries, and compromised medical examiners. In a place where American dollars could buy objective truth, involving the local authorities would be a catastrophic mistake. The very police officers I reported the crime to could easily be on the exact same payroll as the men hired to erase my existence. If the local fixers found out I was sitting in the capital city, I would never make it to the runway. I had to remain entirely invisible. I had to operate in the absolute shadows. David understood the gravity of the systemic corruption. He explained that the embassy offered emergency repatriation loans for destitute American citizens, but the bureaucratic gears were agonizingly slow. The process required physical signatures, manual verifications, and encrypted approvals from Washington to ensure the transaction left no public electronic trail. I told him I did not care how many dense legal forms I had to sign. I told him I would scrub the marble floors of the embassy compound on my hands and knees if it meant securing a safe flight under the radar. David made a series of urgent phone calls. He spoke in hushed, authoritative tones to his superiors behind closed doors. Through sheer determination, he managed to secure a temporary emergency passport, a flimsy paper booklet that officially confirmed I was Thomas Caldwell, a living citizen of the United States. But the secure flight processing and the loan approval would take 3 full days. 3 days of hiding in a foreign capital completely cut off from the civilized world while my son systematically burned my life to the ground. The embassy placed me in a highly secure, incredibly modest hostel located a few miles from their fortified compound. They provided me with a small envelope of local currency for daily meals, just enough to purchase bottled water, plain white rice, and simple beans. The room they assigned me was tiny, claustrophobic, and oppressively hot. The walls were painted a sickly shade of industrial green that seemed to peel away in the brutal, unrelenting humidity. A single rotating fan ticked rhythmically on the plaster ceiling, doing absolutely nothing but pushing the hot, stale air around in endless circles. I sat on a narrow metal cot with a mattress so thin I could feel every rusted iron spring digging sharply into my spine. I was 68 years old. My body had endured 4 decades of brutal, unforgiving manual labor. My knees were shot from years of kneeling on raw concrete floors. My lower back was a tight, twisted knot of chronic pain from carrying heavy spools of industrial copper wiring up flights of temporary wooden stairs. Without my daily prescription medications, my joints swelled aggressively. They throbbed with a dull, relentless ache that made simple movements feel like a monumental task. The physical toll of the suffocating heat, the poor diet, and the sheer unadulterated exhaustion weighed on my shoulders like a literal ton of bricks. Every time I tried to stand up and pace the small room, my legs trembled violently. Every time I tried to close my eyes and sleep, my chest seized with a phantom pressure, a suffocating panic that made me gasp for oxygen in the dark. But the physical breakdown was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological torment that consumed me in the agonizing silence of that green room. The silence was deafening. It allowed my exhausted mind to play cruel, unrelenting tricks on me. I stared at the ceiling and saw Brent's face floating in the shadows. Not the face of the monster who had just abandoned me at the terminal, but the face of the little boy I had loved with every fiber of my being. I remembered teaching him how to ride a small blue bicycle in our suburban driveway. I remembered holding the back of his seat, running alongside him, promising him I would never let him fall. I remembered the sheer innocent joy in his eyes when he finally found his balance and pedaled away from my grasping hands. I remembered standing in the crowded bleachers at his high school graduation clapping until my palms were raw, feeling a profound sense of pride that my son would never have to work with his hands. I had given him the world. I had shielded him from every imaginable hardship. In that stifling hostel room, a crushing, devastating wave of remorse washed over me. I realized that my desperate need to give him a soft, comfortable life had stripped away his basic human empathy. I had built an impenetrable fortress around him, protecting him from consequence, shielding him from the character-building nature of honest struggle. I had paid his massive credit card debts when he recklessly overspent in college. I had purchased a luxury sedan for him when he landed his first entry-level corporate job. I had handed him $68,000 without demanding a single shred of documented proof. I had engineered his devastating sense of entitlement. I had meticulously crafted the very monster who had just sold me to the shadows. The guilt was completely paralyzing. I wept in that small room. I wept for the innocent boy I had lost. I wept for the arrogant man I had failed to raise. I wept for the sheer, profound tragedy of a father realizing his unconditional love had been weaponized into a lethal instrument. By the second night, the tears stopped completely. The sorrow burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, desolate wasteland in my chest. I am a master electrician. My entire life has been defined by diagnosing and fixing broken systems. When a commercial circuit is dangerously overloaded, it trips the main breaker. It shuts down all power to prevent a catastrophic fire. My heart had finally tripped. The naive, trusting father who loved Brent unconditionally was dead. He died on the cracked tile floor of that rural airport terminal. The man sitting on that rusted iron cot was someone entirely different. I was a veteran contractor assessing a catastrophic structural failure. I began to visualize the specific steps I needed to take. I began to mentally map out the complex blueprints of my return. I would not shout. I would not throw violent punches. I would use the very legal laws and corporate structures my son worshipped to dismantle his entire existence. I thought about Sarah, trapped back in Georgia with a sociopath. I realized I was not just saving my own legacy. I had to rescue my daughter-in-law from the suffocating web of my son's grand illusion. The grief completely mutated into a cold, hard, unyielding resolve. On the morning of the third day, David from the embassy arrived at the hostel with a printed airline boarding pass. He drove me directly to the international airport in San Jose. He shook my hand firmly, wished me the best of luck, and told me to be incredibly careful. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the busy terminal. I clutched my temporary paper passport in my sweating hand. I moved through the crowded security lines like a phantom. I was wearing the exact same sweat-stained clothes I had been wearing for 4 agonizing days. I smelled of cheap hostel soap and utter exhaustion. People actively stepped out of my way, avoiding my hollow, determined gaze. I did not care. I felt completely invisible. According to my son's meticulously filed paperwork, I was already a pile of ashes in a foreign crematorium. I was a dead man walking seamlessly among the living. I boarded the commercial airliner and took my assigned seat in the very back row of the cabin. The flight attendant walked down the narrow aisle, offering small plastic cups of chilled water. She looked at my gaunt face, the dark purple bags hanging heavily under my eyes, the noticeable trembling of my calloused hands. She leaned down and asked softly if I was feeling all right. I looked up at her and nodded simply. I told her I was just going home. The plane taxied down the long concrete runway and lifted smoothly into the sky. I pressed my forehead against the cool plastic of the oval window. I watched the dense green jungles and winding rivers of Costa Rica shrink away into the white clouds. The deep hum of the jet engines vibrated through the cabin floorboards, a steady mechanical rhythm that perfectly matched the new cold beating of my heart. The flight lasted several hours, but to me, it felt like an eternity suspended in a complete vacuum. I politely refused the complimentary meals. I refused to close my eyes and rest. I spent the entire journey mentally categorizing every single asset I owned. I calculated the exact market value of Caldwell Commercial Contracting. I reviewed the specific legal clauses of my $4 million life insurance policy. I thought deeply about the men I employed, the loyal foremen and hard-working apprentices who relied on my business to feed their families. Sarah had warned me that Brent was planning to liquidate my life legacy to a massive corporate rival. He was going to sell out my loyal workers just to line his own greedy pockets with fast cash. The thought of my employees losing their livelihoods because of my son's breathtaking greed poured fresh, highly combustible fuel onto the fire burning in my gut. He was not just stealing my life. He was actively destroying the lives of innocent people I cared about. The captain finally announced our initial descent into the United States. I looked out the window and saw the sprawling concrete grids of the American highway system stretching out below. I saw the towering glass skyscrapers reflecting the golden afternoon sun. I had spent 40 years wiring commercial buildings just like those. I had personally laid the heavy conduits that kept the lights on in those massive structures. I knew the complex anatomy of this country. This was my territory. The wheels of the aircraft touched down on the tarmac with a heavy, deeply satisfying jolt. The reverse thrusters roared loudly, slowing us down, pulling me back into the reality of the civilized world. Walking through customs and border protection was a nerve-wracking ordeal. I handed my flimsy emergency passport to the stern federal agent sitting behind the thick plexiglass counter. He scanned the paper document, frowned slightly, and typed rapidly on his keyboard. He asked me a series of random security questions to verify my identity. He asked for my previous home addresses, my mother's maiden name, the make and model of my first commercial work truck. I answered every single question with cold, robotic precision. The agent stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. My heart pounded furiously in my ears. If Brent had already filed the fraudulent death certificate with the State Department, automatic alarms would sound. Sirens would blare across the hall. I would be pulled into a secure back room for an impossible interrogation. But the bureaucratic gears of international fraud are historically slow. Brent's elaborate lies had not yet caught up to the federal database. The agent stamped my temporary paper and handed it back to me. He welcomed me back to the United States. I walked out into this massive, bustling arrivals hall of the airport. Thousands of people were rushing past me, dragging heavy roller luggage, talking loudly on their expensive cell phones, happily hugging their waiting loved ones. I stood completely still in the center of the frantic chaos. I had no luggage to claim from the carousel. I had no vehicle waiting for me in the parking garage. I had no home to return to, not yet. I was a 68-year-old ghost, standing in the middle of a world that legally thought I was gone. But I was breathing. My feet were planted firmly on solid American concrete. I took a deep, steadying breath of the conditioned air. The physical exhaustion that had plagued me for 3 days suddenly evaporated, replaced entirely by a massive surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I walked out the sliding glass doors toward the busy taxi rank. I did not look back. I had a war to wage, and it was going to be fought with paper ink and absolute ruin. The quiet click of the receiver settling into its cradle echoed in the small embassy office, like a heavy steel door slamming shut. I sat completely frozen in the utilitarian chair, staring blindly at the dark plastic phone. The chilling, hushed whisper of my daughter-in-law continued to loop through my mind, playing over and over again on a continuous, agonizing cycle. He sold you to the ghosts. My own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of my strength, had used my unconditional love as the down payment for my execution. David, the young consular officer, quietly opened the wooden door and stepped back into the room. He took one look at my ashen face, my trembling hands, and my hollow eyes. He instantly knew the situation had spiraled far beyond a simple case of a misplaced passport or a negligent travel companion. He pulled his chair out and sat across from his metal desk, leaning forward with a look of deep professional concern. I had to explain my horrific predicament to this young government official without sounding like a raving paranoid lunatic. I took a slow, agonizing breath, forcing the air deep into my lungs to steady my racing heart. I laid out the absolute facts in a low, measured voice. I told him my identity had been stolen, my corporate assets were actively being seized, and the architect of this monstrous betrayal was my own flesh and blood. I explained to David the fragile, highly dangerous nature of my current reality. I could not simply log into a public computer, access my domestic bank accounts, and transfer funds to buy a commercial plane ticket home. Brent was a meticulous, calculating planner. If he had gone to the unbelievable extreme of bribing foreign fixers to fabricate a legal death certificate, he had undoubtedly placed monitoring software on my personal and business accounts back in Georgia. If a sudden international transaction flagged my credit cards or pulled from my checking reserves, Brent would receive an immediate digital alert. He would know his $68,000 bribe had failed. He would realize the ghost he had carefully buried in a foreign system was actively trying to find a way out of the grave. David listened with remarkable stoicism, but I could clearly see the human empathy working behind his steady gaze. He asked if we should involve the local Costa Rican police to report the theft and the fraud. I immediately shook my head. I explained what Sarah had warned me about on the phone. Brent had used my money to purchase a network of corrupt officials, fraudulent notaries, and compromised medical examiners. In a place where American dollars could buy objective truth involving the local authorities would be a catastrophic mistake. The very police officers I reported the crime to could easily be on the exact same payroll as the men hired to erase my existence. If the local fixers found out I was sitting in the capital city, I would never make it to the runway. I had to remain entirely invisible. I had to operate in the absolute shadows. David understood the gravity of the systemic corruption. He explained that the embassy offered emergency repatriation loans for destitute American citizens, but the bureaucratic gears were agonizingly slow. The process required physical signatures, manual verifications, and encrypted approvals from Washington to ensure the transaction left no public electronic trail. I told him I did not care how many dense legal forms I had to sign. I told him I would scrub the marble floors of the embassy compound on my hands and knees if it meant securing a safe flight under the radar. David made a series of urgent phone calls. He spoke in hushed, authoritative tones to his superiors behind closed doors. Through sheer determination, he managed to secure a temporary emergency passport, a flimsy paper booklet that officially confirmed I was Thomas Caldwell, a living citizen of the United States. But the secure flight processing and the loan approval would take 3 full days. 3 days of hiding in a foreign capital completely cut off from the civilized world, while my son systematically burned my life to the ground. The embassy placed me in a highly secure, incredibly modest hostel, located a few miles from their fortified compound. They provided me with a small envelope of local currency for daily meals, just enough to purchase bottled water, plain white rice, and simple beans. The room they assigned me was tiny, claustrophobic, and oppressively hot. The walls were painted a sickly shade of industrial green that seemed to peel away in the brutal, unrelenting humidity. A single rotating fan ticked rhythmically on the plaster ceiling, doing absolutely nothing but pushing the hot, stale air around in endless circles. I sat on a narrow metal cot, with a mattress so thin I could feel every rusted iron spring digging sharply into my spine. I was 68 years old. My body had endured 4 decades of brutal, unforgiving manual labor. My knees were shot from years of kneeling on raw concrete floors. My lower back was a tight, twisted knot of chronic pain from carrying heavy spools of industrial copper wiring up flights of temporary wooden stairs. Without my daily prescription medications, my joints swelled aggressively. They throbbed with a dull, relentless ache that made simple movements feel like a monumental task. The physical toll of the suffocating heat, the poor diet, and the sheer, unadulterated exhaustion weighed on my shoulders like a literal ton of bricks. Every time I tried to stand up and pace the small room, my legs trembled violently. Every time I tried to close my eyes and sleep, my chest seized with a phantom pressure, a suffocating panic that made me gasp for oxygen in the dark. But the physical breakdown was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological torment that consumed me in the agonizing silence of that green room. The silence was deafening. It allowed my exhausted mind to play cruel, unrelenting tricks on me. I stared at the ceiling and saw Brent's face floating in the shadows. Not the face of the monster who had just abandoned me at the terminal, but the face of the little boy I had loved with every fiber of my being. I remembered teaching him how to ride a small blue bicycle in our suburban driveway. I remembered holding the back of his seat, running alongside him, promising him I would never let him fall. I remembered the sheer innocent joy in his eyes when he finally found his balance and pedaled away from my grasping hands. I remembered standing in the crowded bleachers at his high school graduation clapping until my palms were raw, feeling a profound sense of pride that my son would never have to work with his hands. I had given him the world. I had shielded him from every imaginable hardship. In that stifling hostel room, a crushing, devastating wave of remorse washed over me. I realized that my desperate need to give him a soft, comfortable life had stripped away his basic human empathy. I had built an impenetrable fortress around him, protecting him from consequence, shielding him from the character-building nature of honest struggle. I had paid his massive credit card debts when he recklessly overspent in college. I had purchased a luxury sedan for him when he landed his first entry-level corporate job. I had handed him $68,000 without demanding a single shred of documented proof. I had engineered his devastating sense of entitlement. I had meticulously crafted the very monster who had just sold me to the shadows. The guilt was completely paralyzing. I wept in that small room. I wept for the innocent boy I had lost. I wept for the arrogant man I had failed to raise. I wept for the sheer, profound tragedy of a father realizing his unconditional love had been weaponized into a lethal instrument. By the second night, the tears stopped completely. The sorrow burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, desolate wasteland in my chest. I am a master electrician. My entire life has been defined by diagnosing and fixing broken systems. When a commercial circuit is dangerously overloaded, it trips the main breaker. It shuts down all power, to prevent a catastrophic fire. My heart had finally tripped. The naive, trusting father who loved Brent unconditionally was dead. He died on the cracked tile floor of that rural airport terminal. The man sitting on that rusted iron cot was someone entirely different. I was a veteran contractor assessing a catastrophic structural failure. I began to visualize the specific steps I needed to take. I began to mentally map out the complex blueprints of my return. I would not shout. I would not throw violent punches. I would use the very legal laws and corporate structures my son worshipped to dismantle his entire existence. I thought about Sarah trapped back in Georgia with a sociopath. I realized I was not just saving my own legacy. I had to rescue my daughter-in-law from the suffocating web of my son's grand illusion. The grief completely mutated into a cold, hard, unyielding resolve. On the morning of the third day, David from the embassy arrived at the hostel with a printed airline boarding pass. He drove me directly to the international airport in San Jose. He shook my hand firmly, wished me the best of luck, and told me to be incredibly careful. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the busy terminal. I clutched my temporary paper passport in my sweating hand. I moved through the crowded security lines like a phantom. I was wearing the exact same sweat-stained clothes I had been wearing for 4 agonizing days. I smelled of cheap hostel soap and utter exhaustion. People actively stepped out of my way, avoiding my hollow, determined gaze. I did not care. I felt completely invisible. According to my son's meticulously filed paperwork, I was already a pile of ashes in a foreign crematorium. I was a dead man walking seamlessly among the living. I boarded the commercial airliner and took my assigned seat in the very back row of the cabin. The flight attendant walked down the narrow aisle, offering small plastic cups of chilled water. She looked at my gaunt face, the dark purple bags hanging heavily under my eyes, the noticeable trembling of my calloused hands. She leaned down and asked softly if I was feeling all right. I looked up at her and nodded simply. I told her I was just going home. The plane taxied down the long concrete runway and lifted smoothly into the sky. I pressed my forehead against the cool plastic of the oval window. I watched the dense green jungles and winding rivers of Costa Rica shrink away into the white clouds. The deep hum of the jet engines vibrated through the cabin floorboards, a steady mechanical rhythm that perfectly matched the new cold beating of my heart. The flight lasted several hours, but to me it felt like an eternity suspended in a complete vacuum. I politely refused the complimentary meals. I refused to close my eyes and rest. I spent the entire journey mentally categorizing every single asset I owned. I calculated the exact market value of Caldwell Commercial Contracting. I reviewed the specific legal clauses of my $4 million life insurance policy. I thought deeply about the men I employed, the loyal foremen, and hard-working apprentices who relied on my business to feed their families. Sarah had warned me that Brent was planning to liquidate my life legacy to a massive corporate rival. He was going to sell out my loyal workers just to line his own greedy pockets with fast cash. The thought of my employees losing their livelihoods because of my son's breathtaking greed poured fresh, highly combustible fuel onto the fire burning in my gut. He was not just stealing my life. He was actively destroying the lives of innocent people I cared about. The captain finally announced our initial descent into the United States. I looked out the window and saw the sprawling concrete grids of the American highway system stretching out below. I saw the towering glass skyscrapers reflecting the golden afternoon sun. I had spent 40 years wiring commercial buildings just like those. I had personally laid the heavy conduits that kept the lights on in those massive structures. I knew the complex anatomy of this country. This was my territory. The wheels of the aircraft touched down on the tarmac with a heavy, deeply satisfying jolt. The reverse thrusters roared loudly, slowing us down, pulling me back into the reality of the civilized world. Walking through customs and border protection was a nerve-wracking ordeal. I handed my flimsy emergency passport to the stern federal agent sitting behind the thick plexiglass counter. He scanned the paper document, frowned slightly, and typed rapidly on his keyboard. He asked me a series of random security questions to verify my identity. He asked for my previous home addresses, my mother's maiden name, the make and model of my first commercial work truck. I answered every single question with cold, robotic precision. The agent stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. My heart pounded furiously in my ears. If Brent had already filed the fraudulent death certificate with the State Department, automatic alarms would sound. Sirens would blare across the hall. I would be pulled into a secure back room for an impossible interrogation. But the bureaucratic gears of international fraud are historically slow. Brent's elaborate lies had not yet caught up to the federal database. The agent stamped my temporary paper and handed it back to me. He welcomed me back to the United States. I walked out into the massive, bustling arrivals hall of the airport. Thousands of people were rushing past me, dragging heavy roller luggage, talking loudly on their expensive cell phones, happily hugging their waiting loved ones. I stood completely still in the center of the frantic chaos. I had no luggage to claim from the carousel. I had no vehicle waiting for me in the parking garage. I had no home to return to, not yet. I was a 68-year-old ghost standing in the middle of a world that legally thought I was gone. But I was breathing. My feet were planted firmly on solid American concrete. I took a deep, steadying breath of the conditioned air. The physical exhaustion that had plagued me for 3 days suddenly evaporated, replaced entirely by a massive surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I walked out the sliding glass doors toward the busy taxi rank. I did not look back. I had a war to wage, and it was going to be fought with paper ink and absolute ruin. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets when I pulled my borrowed sedan into the gravel parking lot of an old roadside diner on the outskirts of the county. The glowing neon sign above the entrance buzzed loudly and flickered, casting a harsh red light across the wet pavement. I chose this specific place because it was 20 miles outside of the city limits, far away from the upscale neighborhoods and luxury country clubs where my son spent his time. I parked in the darkest corner of the lot and waited with the engine running. 10 minutes later, a small silver compact car pulled in. I watched the driver's side door open, and my daughter-in-law stepped out into the pouring rain. She was wearing a dark hooded raincoat, holding a large leather purse tight against her chest. She looked absolutely terrified, constantly scanning the empty parking lot before rushing toward the diner entrance. I waited a few moments before stepping out into the storm and following her inside. The diner was mostly empty, except for a couple of long-haul truckers drinking black coffee at the front counter. The smell of fried grease and stale coffee filled the damp air. I spotted Sarah sitting in a booth at the very back, clutching a ceramic mug with both hands. When I slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from her, she let out a sharp gasp. Seeing me in the flesh, covered in the deep exhaustion of my 3-day journey, broke whatever fragile composure she had left. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes, and she reached across the sticky table to grab my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. She kept whispering my name over and over, as if she needed to convince herself that I was not a ghost. I squeezed her hands firmly and told her she was incredibly brave for meeting me. I asked her how she had managed to gather the evidence without Brent noticing. Sarah took a deep, shaky breath and explained that my son had become dangerously careless in his arrogance. He was so absolutely certain that his elaborate plan in Costa Rica was flawless that he stopped covering his digital tracks at home. She told me about the day he returned from the trip. He had walked up to their front door, playing the role of the tragic, devastated son, crying fake tears for the benefit of the watching neighbors. But the exact second the front door closed and they were alone, his entire demeanor shifted. The tears vanished instantly. He walked straight to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, and started making aggressive phone calls to commercial real estate brokers. He had been working late in his home office every night, drinking heavily, and celebrating his newfound status as the sole heir to a $10 million contracting empire. When he finally passed out on the leather sofa, Sarah crept into the room and accessed his unlocked laptop. She told me she had suspected something was horribly wrong for weeks leading up to my trip. But she never could have imagined the pure, unadulterated evil she would uncover on that hard drive. She reached into her heavy purse and pulled out a small padded envelope. She slid it across the table toward me. Her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and absolute disgust. Inside that envelope were 3 standard black flash drives. Sarah told me that those small plastic rectangles contained every single digital footprint of my son's betrayal. She had spent hours downloading his private email archives, his encrypted message logs, and his hidden financial ledgers. She detailed the contents to me right there in the booth, and every word she spoke felt like a cold steel blade sliding straight between my ribs. The first flash drive contained the communications with the corrupt foreign fixers. Brent had not just stumbled into a bad crowd. He had actively sought out an international broker who specialized in making people disappear on paper. Sarah had read the emails where my son haggled over the price of my fake death certificate. He negotiated the cost of bribing a local medical examiner to draft a fraudulent autopsy report claiming I had succumbed to a massive coronary event. He even paid an extra $10,000 to secure a phony cremation receipt, ensuring that no American authorities would ever demand to see a physical body. There was a scanned copy of a wire transfer receipt proving that the $68,000 I gave him was sent directly to an offshore account to fund my own execution. The second flash drive contained the domestic side of his sinister operation. It held the expedited corporate succession filings he had prepared with a shady legal consultant months before he ever asked me for the money. He had already drafted the executive orders to liquidate my heavy machinery, my fleet of commercial trucks, and the massive warehouse facility I owned outright. He had compiled a spreadsheet of my biggest commercial competitors, ranking them by who would pay the highest price for a rapid hostile takeover of Caldwell Commercial Contracting. He was pricing out my life work like discarded scrap metal. I sat in the diner booth staring at the padded envelope. The sheer methodical nature of his plot was staggering. He had not acted out of sudden financial desperation. He had spent half a year quietly constructing an airtight legal coffin for me. Sarah looked at me with tears streaming down her face and apologized. She apologized for bringing this monster into our family, for not stopping him sooner, for not warning me before I got on that airplane. I stopped her immediately. I told her none of this was her fault. I told her that sociopaths are experts at wearing perfectly tailored masks. I promised her that I would protect her from the fallout, and that I would make sure she walked away from this marriage completely unscathed. I took the envelope, paid for our untouched coffees, and watched her drive safely away into the stormy night. My next stop was the downtown office of Harrison Cole. Harrison was not a man who intimidated easily. He had been my corporate attorney for 25 years. We had fought through brutal contract disputes, union strikes, and massive commercial liability lawsuits together. He knew my business inside and out, and he knew my family. When I walked into his wood-paneled office later that night, the shock on his face was palpable. I had called him on a secure line earlier to tell him I was coming, but seeing me standing there alive when he had just received a frantic phone call from Brent, claiming I had passed away abroad, left the hardened lawyer completely speechless. I did not waste time on emotional reunions. I threw my wet jacket onto a leather chair and tossed the padded envelope onto his massive oak desk. I told him to plug the flash drives into a secure offline computer. I poured myself a glass of water and paced the length of his office while he opened the files. For 2 solid hours, the only sound in the room was the clicking of Harrison's mouse and the heavy drumming of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched his expression shift from profound shock to professional outrage, and finally to a cold, calculated intensity. When he finished writing the last fraudulent autopsy draft, he leaned back in his chair and took off his reading glasses. He looked at me with a dangerous glint in his eye. He said that what my son had done was not just morally bankrupt. It was a masterclass in federal criminality. He explained that Brent had crossed state and international lines to commit fraud. He had forged medical documents to deceive the United States government. But Harrison told me that if we simply marched into a police station right now and handed over the drives, the local authorities might only be able to charge him with attempted fraud or conspiracy. Brent could afford expensive defense attorneys. He could argue that he was extorted by the foreign fixers. He could spin a narrative that might earn him a reduced sentence or a comfortable plea deal. I slammed my hand down on the edge of the desk. I told Harrison I did not want a plea deal. I did not want a slap on the wrist. I wanted my son to face the absolute maximum consequence for trying to erase my existence. I wanted his entire stolen life dismantled so thoroughly that he would never be able to manipulate another human being again. Harrison nodded slowly, a grim smile forming on his lips. He told me that if I wanted absolute destruction, we had to be patient. We had to set a trap. He laid out a legal strategy that was as ruthless as it was brilliant. We were not going to stop Brent from filing the fake death certificate. We were going to let him proceed. We were going to let the forged documents pass the initial review of the local probate court. We would allow Brent to officially file the claim for my $4 million life insurance policy. We would let him submit the expedited corporate succession papers to the state business registry. Harrison explained the beautiful mechanism of this trap. Every time Brent signed his name to one of those official documents, he was committing a fresh, unarguable felony. Every time he used the internet or the postal service to submit the fraudulent claims, he was committing federal wire fraud and mail fraud. By allowing him to believe he had won, we were encouraging him to dig his own grave deeper and deeper. We would gather the undeniable proof of his completed crimes, locking him into a corner with absolutely no chance of a legal defense. Once the insurance company approved the payout and the state recognized him as the sole corporate owner, the crimes would be finalized. That was the exact moment we would spring the trap. The strategy made perfect logical sense, but the emotional toll it demanded was incredibly heavy. It meant I had to remain a ghost. I had to hide in the shadows of my own city, watching my son play the role of the grieving heir. I had to endure the agonizing reality of seeing my business friends and loyal employees mourn my passing, while the architect of my murder accepted their condolences with open arms. It meant I had to let him sit in my leather office chair, touch my corporate accounts, and walk through the halls of my company acting like a king. Harrison asked me directly if I had the stomach for this kind of waiting game. He warned me that the psychological burden of watching my legacy being temporarily pillaged would be immense. He said it would take at least 3 to 4 weeks for Brent to file the necessary paperwork and schedule his official takeover. 3 to 4 weeks of absolute silence. 3 to 4 weeks of hiding in a cheap hotel room while my son dismantled everything I loved. I walked over to the large window and looked out at the city skyline. I could see the glowing lights of a commercial high-rise I had personally wired 10 years ago. I remembered the grueling hours I spent pulling thick, heavy cables through the concrete shafts of that building, making sure the infrastructure was sound, making sure the foundation could handle the heavy load. I turned back to Harrison and looked him square in the eye. I told him I had spent my entire life doing the hard, invisible work while other people slept. I told him I knew exactly how to wait in the dark. We spent the rest of the night securing our perimeter. Harrison used his extensive network to quietly freeze my personal offshore investment accounts, placing them in a blind trust that Brent would not be able to access or even locate. We set up an encrypted communication channel with Sarah, ensuring she could safely report on Brent's daily activities without raising suspicion. We prepared the massive dossier of digital evidence, carefully logging every single email, every forged signature, and every illegal bank transfer. We built an airtight, undeniable case for the federal investigators. When I finally left Harrison's office, the rain had stopped, and the early light of dawn was just beginning to break over the city. The air was cool and crisp. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and walked toward my borrowed car. The exhaustion was heavy in my bones, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The trap was officially set. The bait was in the water. My son thought he was a brilliant corporate mastermind who had successfully outsmarted an old blue-collar tradesman. He had no idea that the foundation he was standing on was entirely wired with explosives, and I was holding the detonator. The first week inside that anonymous hotel room felt like being buried alive. Harrison had placed me in an extended stay motel off the interstate. It was a bleak, depressing room. The walls were painted a dull beige, and the air conditioner rattled constantly with a loud mechanical hum. I sat in a cheap vinyl chair at a small particle board desk. I spent my days staring at the glowing screen of a secure laptop. Sarah had quietly shared the login credentials for the exterior security cameras mounted around my property. She also managed to sync my son's business email server to a hidden cloud drive. I became a silent witness to my own erasure. I was forced to sit in the dark and watch the boy I raised systematically dismantle my entire life. It started with the house. I had built that custom home with my own 2 hands. I laid the foundation. I wired every single outlet. I installed the custom oak cabinets where my late wife Martha used to store her fine china. On the 3rd morning of my isolation, the motion sensors on the driveway cameras triggered an alert on my laptop. I watched as a massive commercial dumpster was rolled right onto my pristine concrete driveway. Then Brent stepped out of the front door. He was wearing designer casual clothes, holding a cup of premium coffee, barking orders at a crew of hired junk removal workers. My heart physically ached as I watched those strangers carry out pieces of my history. They dragged out the heavy leather recliner where I used to sit and read the evening paper. They carried out the antique grandfather clock that had belonged to my own father. But the moment that truly shattered me was when they brought out a series of heavy cardboard boxes. I recognized those boxes immediately. They contained Martha's belongings. Her hand-stitched quilts, her carefully preserved photo albums documenting our entire family history, her collection of vintage holiday ornaments. Brent did not even open them. He just pointed a dismissive finger toward the dumpster. I watched as 30 years of cherished memories were carelessly tossed into the trash like useless garbage. I gripped the edge of the cheap motel desk so hard my knuckles turned completely white. My breathing became ragged and shallow. I wanted to smash the laptop screen. I wanted to steal a car drive straight to my neighborhood and drag my son away from that dumpster by the collar of his expensive shirt. The anger burned inside my chest like a physical fire. It was a hot, consuming rage that demanded immediate violence. But the calm, ruthless voice of Harrison Cole echoed in my head. He had warned me this would happen. He told me that catching a predator required absolute patience. If I intervened now, if I showed my face to stop him from throwing away old photographs, I would blow the entire federal investigation. Brent would hire high-priced defense lawyers. He would spin a story about a misunderstanding. I had to let him feel invincible. I had to let him believe the world was entirely his to conquer. I forced myself to release my grip on the desk. I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths. I watched my life be thrown away, and I stored every ounce of that pain deep in my soul. The desecration of my home was only the beginning. The next day, Brent moved on to my garage. I had a beautifully restored 1969 Chevrolet Camaro. I had spent 8 years working on that engine on Sunday afternoons. It was my pride and joy. I watched through the garage security feed as a flatbed tow truck backed into the driveway. Brent stood there smiling as he handed the keys to a shady-looking exotic car broker. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was liquidating physical assets for fast, untraceable cash. The title to that car was locked in my office safe, but Brent had clearly forged my signature on a transfer document. I watched the tow truck pull away with my beautiful car. Brent pocketed a thick envelope of cash right there in the driveway. Every action he took was another unarguable felony. He was forging documents, stealing assets, and moving money under false pretenses. He was tightening the noose around his own neck, but watching him do it felt like a slow, agonizing form of torture. The isolation of the motel room amplified the psychological torment. I had no one to talk to. I could not call my old friends. I could not go to the local diner for a cup of coffee. I existed entirely in a state of suspended animation. I paced the stained carpet of the room for hours. My joints ached from the inactivity. My mind raced with dark, intrusive thoughts. I questioned everything I had ever done as a father. I wondered how I had been so completely blind to the monster growing inside my own house. I had given him every advantage. I had shielded him from the harsh realities of the world, and in return he viewed my entire existence as nothing more than an automatic teller machine. He viewed my death as a winning lottery ticket. By the second week, the focus of Brent's destruction shifted from my personal life to my professional legacy. This was where the pain morphed into something far more dangerous. Through the synchronized email servers, I was able to monitor his communications with the corporate executives at Caldwell Commercial Contracting. My company was not just a business to me. It was a living, breathing community. I employed over 100 men and women. I knew their names. I knew their spouses. I knew which of their children were heading off to college. I paid good wages and provided excellent health benefits. I had built a culture of loyalty and hard work. Brent did not care about loyalty. He only cared about rapid liquidation. I sat in the dark motel room reading the emails he sent to my lead project managers. He claimed he was taking emergency executive control of the company while my estate was being settled. He immediately canceled our end-of-year employee bonus program. He froze all internal promotions. Then I read the email that made my blood run absolutely cold. Brent fired David Miller. David was my general foreman. He had worked by my side for 25 years. He was the man who helped me pull wire when we were just starting out. He was a loyal, honest tradesman who had just put his youngest daughter into a nursing program. Brent terminated him with a generic 2-sentence email citing corporate restructuring. He did not even have the courage to look the man in the eye. The injustice of it made my stomach physically churn. Brent was treating my loyal friends like disposable tools. He was stripping the company of its most experienced talent simply to reduce the payroll overhead. He wanted to make the accounting sheets look as lean as possible for a quick sale. Sarah confirmed my worst fears during one of our brief encrypted phone calls. She told me Brent was in aggressive secret negotiations with Apex Conglomerate. Apex was a massive, soulless national corporation known for buying up successful local contractors, stripping them of their assets, firing the local crews, and absorbing their municipal contracts. I had personally rejected 3 buyout offers from Apex over the last decade. I refused to sell my company to a corporation that treated hard-working electricians like replaceable cogs in a machine. Brent knew exactly how I felt about Apex, and he did not care. He reached out to their regional acquisition director days after he returned from Costa Rica. I watched the digital paper trail unfold on my laptop. Brent was desperate for a massive lump sum payout. He did not want to manage an electrical contracting firm. He did not want to wake up at 5 in the morning to negotiate supply chain issues or review commercial blueprints. He wanted millions of dollars in liquid cash to fund his extravagant lifestyle, and he wanted it immediately. I read the preliminary term sheets he exchanged with the Apex lawyers. It was absolutely sickening. My company was independently valued at over $10 million. It was a highly profitable, debt-free enterprise with guaranteed municipal contracts spanning the next 5 years. Brent was offering to sell the entire operation to Apex for $4 million. He was willing to burn $6 million of actual value just to push the sale through the legal system as fast as possible. He was literally selling my life work for pennies on the dollar just to satisfy his breathtaking greed. The agony of sitting in that motel room while my company was butchered was nearly unbearable. I am a man of action. My entire life was built on stepping into the middle of a problem and fixing it with my own hands. Being forced to sit perfectly still while my son dismantled my business felt like a betrayal of my own character. Every time I read a new email outlining the impending sale, my chest tightened with an intense, suffocating pressure. I imagined David packing up his tool belt. I imagined my loyal crews standing in the warehouse confused and worried about their financial futures. I imagined the corporate suits at Apex laughing at how easily they were stealing a lucrative contracting empire from a foolish, greedy kid. I picked up my burner phone several times. I typed in the number for the warehouse. I wanted to call David. I wanted to tell him not to pack his tools. I wanted to tell him that Tommy was still alive and coming back to set things right. But every time my thumb hovered over the call button, I forced myself to stop. I forced myself to put the phone down. If I revealed myself now, I would save the company today, but I would lose the war tomorrow. Brent would simply back away from the sale. He would hire a team of vicious lawyers and claim I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. He would claim the Costa Rica incident was a terrible misunderstanding. He would tie me up in exhausting probate courts and civil litigation for the rest of my natural life. I could not just stop him from selling the business. I had to let him commit the ultimate undeniable fraud. I had to let him sign his name on the final corporate transfer deeds. I had to let him accept the stolen money. I had to let him cross the legal threshold where no defense attorney in the world could possibly save him. So I swallowed my pride. I swallowed my anger. I sat in that sweltering, cheap motel room and practiced the discipline of a master tradesman. I treated the waiting period like a highly dangerous electrical circuit. You cannot rush the process. You have to let the energy build. You have to respect the system, or it will turn around and destroy you. I spent the final week of my isolation watching the final pieces of his trap fall perfectly into place. Brent received the official stamped death certificate from his corrupt contacts in Costa Rica. He submitted it to the domestic life insurance company. He submitted the forged power of attorney documents to the state business registry. He was officially recognized by the state as the sole legal executor of the Caldwell estate. He was completely drunk on his own perceived brilliance. He believed he had executed the perfect crime. He believed he was entirely untouchable. I watched him send out a mass digital invitation for a memorial gala. He was not satisfied with quietly stealing my empire. His narcissism demanded a grand public spectacle. He rented out the grand ballroom of the most exclusive country club in the county. He invited all my major business partners, the local politicians I had supported, and the wealthy elite of the city. He billed it as a celebration of my legacy. In reality, Sarah told me he planned to use the emotional momentum of the memorial to publicly announce the sale of Caldwell Commercial Contracting to Apex. He was going to stand in front of my friends, shed crocodile tears over my tragic passing, and then sign the final acquisition papers in the back room with the corporate lawyers. Reading that invitation was the turning point. The lingering sorrow I felt for the loss of my son evaporated completely. The agonizing pain of the last 3 weeks crystallized into something sharp, bright, and utterly indestructible. He wanted a public spectacle. He wanted an audience to witness his grand ascension to wealth and power. I closed my laptop and packed my small duffel bag. My hands were no longer shaking. My heart was no longer racing with anxiety. I felt a profound, chilling sense of absolute clarity. Brent had spent a month digging an incredibly deep, elaborate grave for me. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot to make sure I was actually inside it before he started throwing the dirt. The waiting was finally over. The final circuit was completely wired. It was time to flip the switch and let the whole corrupt structure burn. The digital invitation arrived in my secure inbox on a Tuesday afternoon, glowing against the harsh backlight of my laptop screen. It was an immaculate, professionally designed graphic, trimmed in tasteful black and silver. At the top, in elegant, sweeping cursive, it read, "A celebration of life and legacy." Below that sickeningly sweet headline was my own name, Thomas Caldwell. The invitation cordially requested the presence of the city's elite at the Grand Arbor Country Club for a memorial gala and official corporate succession announcement. I sat in that suffocating motel room and stared at the screen until my eyes physically burned. The sheer unadulterated audacity of my son was almost difficult to comprehend. He was not just satisfied with quietly burying me in a foreign jungle and stealing my life savings. He craved the applause of high society while he did it. According to the encrypted messages Sarah smuggled to me, Brent had rented out the most expensive ballroom in the county. The guest list was a calculated roster of wealth and influence. He had invited local politicians whose campaigns I had supported for decades. He invited commercial developers who had relied on my electrical contracting firm to wire their municipal projects. He even invited the very rival executives from Apex Conglomerate who were flying in specifically to carve up my business like vultures over a fresh kill. My son was using my funeral as a networking event. He intended to stand in front of my oldest friends, shed perfectly rehearsed tears over my tragic passing, and then smoothly transition into signing the final transfer deeds liquidating 40 years of my blood sweat and calloused hands. The grotesque nature of his plan turned my stomach. I had spent my entire adult life out in the elements, freezing in the winter mud and suffocating in the southern summer heat, just so I could provide an honest living for my crews and a comfortable life for my family. I had never sought the spotlight. I despised the country club crowd, those soft-handed men who made millions moving numbers on a spreadsheet without ever knowing the honest ache of a hard day's work. Brent knew how much I loathed that world. Yet there he was, preparing to hand over my life work to the exact kind of corporate predators I had fought against for 40 years. He was going to sell out my loyal foreman and dedicated apprentices just to secure a massive, untraceable cash buyout for himself. I closed the laptop and picked up my burner phone. I dialed Harrison Cole. When my longtime corporate attorney answered, I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him about the gala. I told him about the succession announcement. I told him that I was absolutely done waiting in the dark. Harrison did not sound surprised. In fact, I could hear a distinct cold satisfaction in his voice. He told me to put on my best shirt and get over to his office immediately. The waiting period was officially over. It was time to pull the net closed. When I arrived at Harrison's heavy oak paneled office an hour later, the room was buzzing with a quiet, lethal energy. Harrison was not alone. Sitting across from his massive desk were 3 men and 1 woman wearing sharply tailored, unremarkable suits. They had the rigid, observant posture of people who dealt with serious consequences for a living. Harrison introduced them. They were investigators from the State Fraud Division and 2 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Task Force. The lead federal agent, a tall, pragmatic man named Davis, shook my hand with a firm, respectful grip. He did not look at me with the pitying eyes I had seen at the embassy. He looked at me like a vital asset in a major tactical operation. Agent Davis opened a thick manila folder on the conference table. He laid out the absolute scale of Brent's criminality. The federal authorities had been quietly monitoring the situation since Harrison flagged the initial offshore wire transfers. They had tracked the $68,000 I sent my son. They watched it flow through a series of shell accounts directly into the pockets of the corrupt Costa Rican fixers. They had intercepted the fraudulent death certificate when Brent proudly submitted it to the domestic life insurance company. But most importantly, they had complete visibility on his communication with the Apex conglomerate acquisition team. The federal agents had everything they needed to arrest him for wire fraud, but Harrison and Agent Davis had agreed on a far more devastating strategy. If they arrested Brent right now, his high-priced defense lawyers might try to spin a narrative of a chaotic misunderstanding. They might try to argue that Brent honestly believed I had died and was simply rushing the corporate transition out of panic. To secure a flawless, undeniable conviction, they needed him to commit the final ultimate act of theft in a completely public forum. They needed him to physically sign the transfer deeds accepting the corporate buyout funds while legally acting as the fraudulent executor of my estate. "We are going to let him step up to that podium," Agent Davis explained, his voice low and steady. "We are going to let him look your friends in the eye and lie about your death. We are going to let the Apex lawyers place the final acquisition contracts on the table. The exact second his pen leaves the paper, the crime is completely finalized. That is the point of no return. The moment that ink dries, he is looking at consecutive federal sentences for grand theft insurance fraud and international conspiracy." The sheer mechanical precision of the trap was breathtaking. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany table. I looked at the federal agents and asked what my exact role would be in this operation. I did not want to sit in a surveillance van. I did not want to watch the arrest on a delayed video feed. I wanted to be in the room. I wanted my son to see the ghost he created standing right in front of him when his entire stolen empire collapsed. Harrison smiled. It was the sharp, dangerous smile of a man who had won countless boardroom wars. He told me that was exactly the plan. The country club was already heavily compromised. The catering staff for the event had been swapped out for undercover state investigators. The valet drivers were plain-clothes federal marshals. The entire perimeter of the Grand Arbor Country Club would be completely locked down by local law enforcement the moment the gala began. No one was getting in, and absolutely no one was getting out. Harrison laid out this timeline. Brent had scheduled the memorial tribute for 8 o'clock in the evening. After the speeches and the hypocritical toasts, he was hosting a private signing ceremony in the adjoining Crystal Room with the Apex executives. That was the moment. That was when I would walk through the double doors. I would not be wearing a wire. I would not be carrying a weapon. My mere presence, standing alive and breathing in front of his wealthy audience, would be the ultimate undeniable proof of his monumental fraud. The federal agents would handle the arrest. My job was simply to be the absolute destruction of his reality. The meeting lasted late into the evening as we finalized every logistical detail. We reviewed the architectural blueprints of the country club, mapping out the entrances, the exits, and the security blind spots. We established secure communication signals. We went over the contingency plans in case Brent tried to run. But I knew my son. He was a coward wrapped in arrogance. When confronted with genuine authority, he would not run. He would freeze. He would crumble. I drove back to my cheap motel room under the cover of a starless, overcast sky. The air felt heavy, charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. I unlocked the thin metal door and stepped into the suffocating beige room for the very last time. Tomorrow night, I would leave this temporary prison and take my life back. But tonight I had to prepare myself psychologically for the hardest thing a father could ever do. I opened my worn canvas duffel bag and pulled out the only suit I had managed to buy since returning to the States. It was a simple dark navy suit. Not designer, not flashy. Just the kind of honest, dependable clothing a working man wears to a wedding or a funeral. I hung it carefully on the edge of the closet door. I took out a cheap travel iron and spent an hour pressing out every single wrinkle. I focused entirely on the repetitive mechanical motion. The heat of the iron, the hiss of the steam, the crisp line of the fabric. It grounded me. It kept my mind from spiraling into the dark, agonizing grief of what I was about to do. I was about to walk into a room and permanently destroy my own son. I was about to strip away his freedom, his reputation, and his future. The soft, forgiving father who had wired him $68,000 to save his life was completely gone. I had to bury that man in the Costa Rican jungle. The man pressing this suit was a master electrician preparing to cut the power on a dangerously corrupt circuit. Brent had made his choices. He had looked at my decades of sacrifice and seen nothing but a cash register. He had forced his quiet, terrified wife to live in a state of absolute fear. He had tossed my late wife's cherished memories into a commercial dumpster without a second thought. He had fired the loyal men who helped build the very company he was trying to sell. He had crossed the point of no return long before he ever planned this gala. Now it was simply time for the consequences to catch up to him. I laid my clean white shirt on the edge of the narrow mattress. I polished my heavy leather work boots until they shined. I did not buy new dress shoes. I wanted to wear the boots that had carried me through 40 years of honest labor. I wanted Brent to look down and see the boots of the tradesman he thought he could so easily discard. I sat in the single vinyl chair by the window and watched the clock on the nightstand slowly tick past midnight. I did not sleep a single wink. My mind was crystal clear. My heart beat with a slow, heavy, relentless rhythm. I thought about the sheer scale of the illusion Brent had constructed for tomorrow night. The expensive champagne, the floral arrangements, the somber classical music playing in the background. He had meticulously orchestrated a high society masterpiece built entirely on a foundation of unforgivable lies. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought his expensive suits and corporate vocabulary made him invincible. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about the men who actually build the world. You can put up all the fancy wallpaper you want. You can install the most expensive crystal chandeliers in the ceiling. But if the foundation is cracked and the wiring is corrupt, the entire structure will inevitably burn to the ground. And tomorrow night, in front of the entire city, I was going to be the spark that ignited the fire. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the cheap plastic blinds of the motel window, I finally stood up. The mechanical hum of the air conditioner felt like the distant rumbling of a heavy diesel engine. I walked into the small, cramped bathroom and splashed freezing cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the spotted mirror. The deep purple exhaustion that had haunted my eyes for the past 3 weeks was completely gone. The hollow, desperate look of a man who had been abandoned in a foreign country had been replaced by the hardened, unyielding stare of a survivor. I dried my face with a rough cotton towel and walked back into the main room. My burner phone vibrated on the desk. It was a text message from Harrison, a single brief sentence confirming that the state warrants had been officially signed by a judge. The federal indictments were locked and sealed. The plainclothes agents were already moving into their designated positions at the country club. The trap was fully armed. There was absolutely no backing out now. No. I spent the next few hours pacing the room, going over the precise sequence of events in my head. I knew the apex conglomerate executives would arrive early. They were corporate sharks, eager to smell the blood in the water. They would want to review the final liquidation contracts before the memorial service began. Brent would be catering to their every whim, desperate to secure the wire transfer that would fund his new stolen life. I imagined him shaking their hands, offering them expensive cigars, playing the role of the reluctant but responsible heir, stepping up to save his father's failing legacy. The sheer hypocrisy of it all made my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. Sarah had sent one final encrypted update before going silent. She told me Brent had spent the morning practicing his eulogy in front of the hallway mirror. She said he had actually bought a special brand of eye drops to make his eyes look red and tearful for the audience. The level of sociopathic dedication was genuinely terrifying. He was not just stealing my money. He was directing a theatrical performance of my death for his own personal glorification. But the curtain was about to drop on his grand performance. The elite crowd at the Grand Arbor Country Club was expecting a tragic story of a hard-working father who passed away suddenly in a foreign land. They were expecting a smooth, respectful transition of corporate power. They had no idea they were holding front-row tickets to a federal takedown. I put on my pressed shirt and buttoned it slowly, methodically. I slipped into my dark navy suit jacket. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled on my heavy, scuffed leather work boots, lacing them up tight. I did not need a tie. I did not need cufflinks. I was not going to a high society party. I was going to a demolition site. I grabbed my room key, stepped out into the humid morning air, and drove my borrowed sedan toward the city limits. The countdown had officially begun, and I was ready to bring the entire corrupt structure crashing down. The thick mahogany doors of the Grand Arbor Country Club ballroom stood closed just a few feet away from me. I waited in the dim lighting of the service corridor. The air conditioning was freezing. It carried the scent of expensive floral arrangements and roasted prime rib. I stood perfectly still. I listened to the muffled sounds of high society mingling on the other side of the wood. Harrison Cole stood to my right. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit. His arms were crossed over his chest. To my left stood Agent Davis and another federal marshal. They were wearing plain, dark suits with their official badges clipped out of sight. We were a quiet execution squad, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My heavy leather work boots felt strangely out of place on the polished marble floor of the catering hallway, but I had never felt more grounded in my entire life. Through a small gap in the service doors, I had a clear view of the stage. The ballroom was packed with hundreds of people. I saw men and women I had known for decades. I saw city council members. I saw commercial developers who had trusted my contracting firm with their biggest projects. I even saw some of my own senior foremen sitting uncomfortably at a table near the back. They were wearing their best church suits. They looked genuinely devastated. They were mourning the loss of a man who was standing less than 50 feet away from them. The sheer scale of the illusion was breathtaking. My son had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate his own staggering greed. The soft classical music playing over the sound system slowly faded away. A hush fell over the massive room. Brent stepped up to the crystal podium. He looked immaculate. He was wearing a custom-tailored black suit that probably cost more than my first work truck. He adjusted the microphone with a practiced, somber expression. He looked out at the audience and bowed his head just a fraction of an inch. It was the perfect picture of a grieving son carrying the heavy burden of a tragic loss. I felt my stomach turn. I watched him pull a small white handkerchief from his pocket and dab the corner of his eye. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Brent began. His voice echoed through the massive speakers. It was thick with fake emotion. It trembled perfectly. "You are all here because you knew the man my father was. Thomas Caldwell was a giant. He was a man who built his life with his bare hands. He built a legacy from the ground up. He taught me everything I know about honor. He taught me about integrity. He taught me that a man's word is his ultimate bond." I felt a hot wave of pure disgust wash over me. He was standing there using my name to polish his own image. He was talking about honor and integrity while he actively plotted to steal the very foundation I had laid. I looked at the VIP table, positioned directly to the right of the podium. 3 men in expensive gray suits sat there, watching Brent with hungry, predatory smiles. I recognized them immediately. They were the regional acquisition executives from Apex Conglomerate. They had a thick leather binder resting on the table in front of them. It contained the final corporate transfer deeds. It contained the legal paperwork that would permanently liquidate Caldwell Commercial Contracting. My father loved his company. Brent continued. He swept his gaze across the room. He loved the men and women who worked for him. But the world is changing. The commercial landscape is shifting. In the wake of this sudden, unimaginable tragedy, I have had to make incredibly difficult decisions. I have had to look at the future of Caldwell Commercial Contracting and ask myself what my father would want. He would want security for his employees. He would want his legacy to be protected by a larger, stronger family. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost hypnotic. He was manipulating hundreds of intelligent people. He was painting himself as the reluctant savior of a failing enterprise. I watched him gesture gracefully toward the Apex executives. The men at the VIP table nodded in solemn agreement. "That is why tonight we are not just mourning a great man," Brent said. His voice grew a little stronger, a little more confident. "We are ensuring his life work lives on. I am proud to announce that Caldwell Commercial Contracting will be joining the Apex Conglomerate family. This partnership will guarantee that my father's vision is preserved for decades to come." A polite ripple of applause moved through the wealthy crowd. The country club elite clapped for a business deal. They had no idea they were applauding a hostile corporate theft. My loyal foremen sitting in the back did not clap. They stared at the floor. They knew exactly what Apex did to local crews. They knew their jobs were already gone. One of the Apex executives stood up from his chair. He picked up the heavy leather binder and walked up the short steps to the podium. He placed the binder directly in front of Brent. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his inside pocket and handed it to my son. This was the moment. This was the exact legal threshold Harrison and the federal agents had been waiting for. Brent took the pen. He looked out at the audience one last time. He gave them a brave, tragic smile. He lowered his head and hovered the pen over the signature line of the transfer deed. I looked at Harrison Cole. The corporate attorney did not say a single word. He just gave me a slow, firm nod. Agent Davis reached out and pushed the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door. The door swung open. It hit the wall with a loud, resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. I stepped out of the shadows and walked into the bright chandelier light. I did not rush. I did not run. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with the slow, deliberate stride of a man inspecting a job site. The heavy soles of my leather work boots struck the polished marble floor with a rhythmic, booming thud. Thud, thud, thud. Harrison walked slightly behind my right shoulder. The two federal marshals flanked my left. The polite murmurs in the room died instantly. The silence that fell over the Grand Arbor Country Club was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet. The air itself seemed to freeze. As I walked past the round banquet tables, I saw the faces of my friends and business partners. I saw their eyes go wide with pure, unadulterated shock. A woman sitting near the aisle dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the massive room, but nobody moved a single muscle. A man I had known for 20 years raised a trembling hand and pointed at me. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. I ignored the crowd. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage. Brent was still standing at the crystal podium. The silver pen was frozen halfway to the paper. He looked up. His eyes locked onto mine. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. His perfectly tanned skin turned the color of wet ash. His mouth fell open in a silent scream of absolute terror. He looked like a man who had just seen the devil himself rise from the grave. His hands began to shake so violently that the silver pen slipped from his fingers. It clattered loudly against the crystal podium and rolled onto the floor. He backed away from the microphone. He stumbled against the heavy velvet curtain behind the stage. He was hyperventilating. He kept shaking his head back and forth as if trying to physically deny the reality standing right in front of him. The apex executive standing next to him looked completely bewildered. He stared at me and then looked at the crowd. He had absolutely no idea who I was or why my presence had just turned a lively gala into a frozen nightmare. I reached the front of the room and stopped directly at the base of the stage stairs. I looked up at my son. The boy I had loved, the boy I had protected, the boy who had sold my life to a gang of corrupt fixers in Costa Rica, was gone. He was nothing but a terrified, hollow shell trembling under the bright stage lights. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not need to. The silence in the room was so profound that my regular speaking voice carried all the way to the back wall. "You forgot one thing about the men who build the foundations, Brent," I said. My voice was low, even, and completely stripped of mercy. "We know how to handle the pressure." Brent opened his mouth to speak, but he could not form a single coherent word. He gasped for air like a drowning man. He raised a shaking hand toward me. "Dad." He finally choked out. The word sounded like a dying rasp. "Dad, you are supposed to be dead." I finished the sentence for him. I took one step up the carpeted stairs. I looked directly into his terrified eyes. "I am supposed to be a pile of anonymous ashes in a foreign crematorium. Is that what you told them, Brent? Is that what you paid $68,000 to guarantee?" A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The crowd of high society elites suddenly realized they were not witnessing a miraculous resurrection. They were witnessing the exposure of a monstrous crime. Whispers of horror and confusion erupted from the tables. The apex executive suddenly realized the severe legal danger he was standing in. He lunged forward and tried to snatch the leather binder off the podium. He wanted to hide the fraudulent transfer deeds. Agent Davis moved with lightning speed. He stepped up onto the stage and placed a heavy hand firmly on the leather binder. He flashed his federal badge directly in the executive's face. "I highly recommend you step back, sir," Agent Davis said. His voice was absolute granite. "That document is now classified as evidence in a federal investigation." The corporate shark threw his hands up in the air and scrambled backwards away from the podium. He looked at Brent with pure corporate rage. "You told us you were the sole legal executor." The executive shouted. "You told us your father was deceased." Brent ignored the angry corporate suit. He was staring at me with tears spilling down his pale face. He fell to his knees on the stage. He did not care about his tailored suit. He did not care about his high society audience. He was completely broken. "Dad, please," he begged. His voice echoed through the microphone still sitting on the podium. "Please, you have to listen to me. It was a mistake. It was all a terrible misunderstanding. I never wanted to hurt you. I can fix this. I can give it all back." I stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at the pathetic, weeping man. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, burning sorrow that had consumed me in the Costa Rican hostel was entirely gone. The father who would have rushed forward to pick him up and comfort him was dead. "You cannot fix a burned-down house, Brent," I said quietly. "You cannot unforge a death certificate. And you certainly cannot undo the federal wire fraud you committed when you transferred my hard-earned money to an offshore account to pay for my execution." Agent Davis and the second federal marshal stepped forward. They flanked my son on both sides. "Brent Caldwell," Agent Davis announced. His voice boomed across the silent ballroom. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, international conspiracy to commit fraud, and grand theft. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately." The marshal grabbed Brent's arms and pulled them roughly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the stage was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a completely corrupted circuit being permanently severed. It was the sound of ultimate, undeniable justice. Brent sobbed uncontrollably as they hauled him to his feet. He looked out at the audience. The wealthy friends he had invited to witness his triumph were staring at him with absolute disgust. The politicians he had courted were already turning their backs, pulling out their cell phones to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. My loyal foremen standing in the back of the room were watching with grim, fierce satisfaction. They marched my son off the stage and down the center aisle. He dragged his feet, weeping like a child, begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I did not watch him leave. I walked over to the crystal podium. I looked down at the heavy leather binder resting there. The fraudulent acquisition contract was sitting open. The signature line was blank. The silver pen rested harmlessly on the floor where it had fallen. Harrison Cole stepped up to the podium beside me. He looked down at the unexecuted contract and smiled his cold, ruthless smile. He picked up the leather binder and snapped it shut. "It looks like the Caldwell estate is no longer taking bids," he said loud enough for the Apex executives to hear. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces in the grand ballroom. My friends, my partners, my employees. They were all waiting for me to say something. They were waiting for an explanation for the unbelievable drama they had just witnessed. I did not owe them a grand speech. I did not need to play the role of the tragic victim. I was just a working man who had protected his own house. I grabbed the microphone from the stand. I looked at the back of the room where David Miller and my loyal crew leaders were standing. I smiled at them. A real, genuine smile. "I am sorry for the interruption, folks," I said. My voice was strong and completely steady. "But Caldwell Commercial Contracting is not for sale. We open for business tomorrow morning at 6 sharp. I suggest you all go home and get some rest. We have a lot of work to do." I set the microphone gently on the podium. I turned my back on the crystal chandeliers, the catered food, and the whispering crowd of elite society. I walked down the stairs and out the side door of the ballroom. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in an agonizing month, I finally felt like I could breathe. A high-pitched squeal from the audio system pierced the stagnant air of the grand ballroom. It was a sharp and abrasive sound that seemed to snap the entire crowd out of their collective paralysis. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the terrified creature trembling behind the crystal podium. My heavy leather work boots were firmly planted on the thick carpet of the stage. I felt a profound sense of absolute grounding. I was a man who had spent 4 decades building solid foundations out of concrete and steel. I knew exactly how to stand my ground when the wind started howling. Agent Davis moved with the kind of smooth and practiced efficiency that only comes from years of taking down highly arrogant criminals. He did not shout. He did not need to use excessive force. The sheer weight of his federal authority was an invisible gravity that pulled the remaining oxygen straight out of the room. He stepped up onto the stage right beside me. His dark suit absorbed the harsh spotlight shining down from the vaulted ceiling. He reached out and grabbed the microphone stand. He angled the silver mesh receiver directly toward his own mouth. The words Agent Davis spoke echoed off the walls and the expensive crystal chandeliers. They were not just legal terms. They were the absolute final nails in a coffin my son had spent months building with his own 2 hands. Davis announced the charges with a cold and devastating clarity. His voice boomed across the silent room. He declared that Brent Caldwell was under immediate arrest for grand theft of corporate assets. He listed the charge of international conspiracy to commit identity fraud. He clearly stated the charges of federal wire fraud and federal mail fraud. And then he delivered the absolute centerpiece of this orchestrated betrayal. He charged Brent with federal life insurance fraud. Every single syllable rang out like a heavy steel hammer striking an anvil. Brent physically deteriorated before my very eyes. The arrogant corporate mastermind who had stood there just moments ago lecturing the city elite about legacy and honor completely vanished. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the stage with a heavy, pathetic thud. His expensive, custom-tailored trousers wrinkled against the rough carpet. He landed hard on his knees. He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The special eye drops he had used to fake his grieving tears for the audience were now mixing with the genuine sweat of a man who realized his life was entirely over. The men in the expensive gray suits from Apex Conglomerate were already scrambling backward. They looked exactly like rats fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal indictment. They bumped into the tall floral arrangements, knocking white roses onto the polished floor. They dropped their leather binders. They abandoned Brent the exact second he became a legal liability. That was the absolute loyalty of the corporate world he worshipped so deeply. They did not care about him. They did not care about my legacy. They only cared about the cheap price he had offered for my company. Now that the deal was exposed as a massive federal crime, they scattered into the shadows. Brent reached his shaking hands out toward me. He grabbed the fabric of my trousers. He wept openly. The sound of his sobbing was amplified by the microphone that rested near his knees on the stage floor. The entire ballroom could hear his pathetic whimpering. "Dad, please," he begged. His voice cracked and pitched upward in total desperation. "You have to tell them to stop. You have to tell them this is a huge mistake. I can fix this. I promise I can fix this. I will give everything back to you. I will go to counseling. I will do whatever you want. Just please do not let them take me away." I looked down at him, and I searched my soul for a single ounce of pity. I searched for the warm, forgiving, fatherly instinct that had defined my entire existence. I thought about the decades I spent pulling heavy copper wire through freezing concrete buildings. I thought about the thick calluses on my hands and the permanent ache in my lower back. I endured all of that physical pain so this boy would never have to know what true hardship felt like. I gave him a life of absolute comfort. I gave him expensive private schools and luxury cars. And he took all of that love, all of that sacrifice, and he weaponized it into a blade. He used my own hard-earned money to buy a fake death certificate from corrupt officials in a foreign jungle. He tried to erase my existence just so he could sell my life work to a group of soulless corporate predators. I did not move a single muscle. I did not kick his hands away. I simply looked down at him with a cold and absolute clarity. I realized in that exact moment that the son I had loved so deeply was gone. The little boy who used to wait for me by the front door when I came home from the job site had died a very long time ago. The man kneeling on the floor in front of me was a complete stranger. He was a dangerous parasite. He was a calculating sociopath who had locked his terrified wife in a cycle of emotional abuse. He had thrown away my late wife's precious photographs like they were useless garbage. He had fired my most loyal employees without a single shred of remorse. He was a monster wearing my son's face. "You do not have anything left to give back, Brent," I said. My voice was low, but it carried a weight that made him flinch. "You sold my company. You sold your wife. You sold your own soul for a pile of fast cash. The only thing you have left is the consequence of your own actions." Agent Davis gave a sharp nod to the two federal marshals waiting at the edge of the stage. They stepped forward with mechanical precision. They were large, unyielding men who had absolutely no patience for corporate criminals. They grabbed Brent by his arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. Brent resisted for a brief, pathetic second. He tried to pull his arms away. He tried to twist his body back toward me, but the marshals simply overpowered him. They forced his soft, manicured hands behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of systemic karma finally catching up to a man who thought he could outsmart the universe. It was the sound of a completely corrupted circuit being permanently severed. "Brent Caldwell," one of the marshals said directly into his ear. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The reading of the Miranda rights broke whatever spell was holding the ballroom captive. The silence finally shattered into a million chaotic pieces. The crowd of high society elites suddenly realized they were sitting in the middle of a massive crime scene. Whispers of absolute horror and intense confusion erupted from the round banquet tables. Chairs scraped loudly against the marble floor as people began to stand up. The marshals turned Brent around and began to walk him down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. This was the exact public spectacle he had craved, but the script had been entirely flipped. He was no longer the tragic hero stepping up to save a failing empire. He was a humiliated, exposed criminal being paraded in front of the entire city. Brent stumbled forward, his polished dress shoes dragged against the carpet. He wept and begged the people at the tables for help. He looked at the local politicians he had tried to bribe with my money. The politicians physically turned their backs. They looked away completely, pretending they did not even know his name. They were already calculating how fast they could distance their political campaigns from this radioactive fallout. He looked at the wealthy country club members he had tried to impress with his expensive suits and grand speeches. They stared at him with pure revulsion. The grand society he had desperately wanted to rule was now rejecting him completely. He was being stripped of his dignity, his stolen assets, and his freedom right in front of everyone he wanted to conquer. I stood perfectly still on the stage and watched the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom open. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting outside in the night bled through the frosted glass windows of the main lobby. The spinning lights cast long moving shadows across the pristine walls of the country club. The marshals pushed Brent through the doors and out into the cold reality of the criminal justice system. The doors swung shut behind him, cutting off the sound of his pathetic sobbing. The trap had snapped shut with absolute perfection. Harrison Cole walked up and stood beside me at the podium. The ruthless corporate attorney looked down the empty aisle and let out a long, slow breath. He reached down and picked up the heavy leather binder that the Apex executive had abandoned on the crystal stand. He opened the binder and looked at the fraudulent acquisition contract. The signature line was completely blank. Brent had never gotten the chance to sign away my life. Harrison pulled the thick, heavy paper out of the binder. He gripped the top edge and tore the contract completely in half. He dropped the torn pieces onto the floor, letting them flutter down onto the stage like dead leaves. "The Caldwell estate is officially off the market," Harrison said. His voice was laced with a deep, dark satisfaction. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces in the grand ballroom. My friends, my partners, my employees were all staring at me. They were waiting for me to say something. They were waiting for a grand explanation for the unbelievable drama they had just witnessed. They wanted me to play the role of the triumphant victim, returning from the grave. I did not owe them a grand speech. I did not need to perform for this crowd. I was just a working man who had protected his own house from a thief. I scanned the very back of the room. I looked past the wealthy developers and the panicked politicians. I found the table where my general foreman, David Miller, was standing. David was a large, burly man who had worked by my side through 30 years of blistering heat and freezing rain. He had been fired by my son just 2 weeks ago through a cowardly email. David had tears shining in his eyes. He stood up straight, raised his rough, calloused hand, and gave me a slow, deeply respectful salute. The other crew leaders standing around him did the exact same thing. I nodded back at them. The foundation of my life had been tested by a massive, catastrophic earthquake, but the concrete held. The structure remained completely intact. The rot had been identified, and it had been entirely excised from the building. I reached out and grabbed the microphone from the stand. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, even tone of a man giving instructions on a job site. "I apologize for the interruption, folks," I said. "But Caldwell Commercial Contracting is absolutely not for sale. We are going to open for business tomorrow morning at 6 sharp. I suggest you all go home and get some rest. We have a lot of work to do." I set the microphone gently back onto the podium. I turned my back on the crystal chandeliers, the expensive catered food, and the whispering crowd of elite society. I walked down the short steps of the stage. Harrison Cole walked right beside me. We moved down the center aisle, passing the abandoned tables and the spilled champagne. The crowd parted for me, completely stepping out of my way, with a newfound sense of absolute respect. I walked out the side doors of the country club and stepped into the cool, humid night air. The storm had passed. The sky was beginning to clear, revealing the bright, hard stars shining above the city. For the first time in an agonizing month, I took a deep, full breath of clean air. The heavy, crushing weight of betrayal was finally gone. The ghost my son tried to create had officially vanished. I was Thomas Caldwell. I was a master electrician. I was a man who built things that lasted, and I had finally taken my entire life back. 6 full months have passed since the heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom swung shut and trapped my son inside his own elaborate nightmare. The brutal, suffocating heat of the Georgia summer has finally broken, giving way to the crisp and clear mornings of late autumn. The changing of the seasons feels incredibly fitting this year. It feels like the earth itself is taking a deep, cleansing breath after a long and toxic storm. I am sitting on the custom cedar deck I built with my own 2 hands 20 years ago. I am holding a thick ceramic mug filled with dark, bitter coffee. The steam rises into the cool morning air, mixing with the faint smell of pine needles and damp soil. The world around me is completely silent, and for the first time in a very long time, my mind is entirely at peace. The process of reclaiming my life was not an easy task, but I am a man who has spent 40 years constructing heavy commercial foundations. I know exactly how to rebuild from the ground up. Walking back into my home the morning after the gala was a deeply jarring experience. The spaces where my heavy leather recliner and my antique grandfather clock used to sit were completely empty. The quiet corners where my late wife Martha had carefully arranged her beautiful family photo albums were bare. Brent had tossed decades of our cherished family history into a commercial dumpster just to clear the stage for his rapid liquidation. At first, the sight of those empty spaces filled my chest with a sharp, agonizing sorrow. I thought about the physical loss of those precious items. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized something profoundly important. Wood and paper do not hold the true weight of a memory. The love I shared with Martha, the honest life we built together, is permanently wired into my soul. No greedy child and no hired junk removal crew can ever throw that away. I bought new furniture. I painted the walls a fresh, bright white. I reclaimed my sanctuary and purged every lingering shadow my son had left behind. The federal justice system moves with a slow grinding and absolutely terrifying certainty. Harrison Cole and Agent Davis ensured that the net wrapped around Brent was entirely inescapable. My son did not get the chance to hire high-priced defense lawyers and spin a tragic narrative for a sympathetic jury. He was cornered by his own digital footprints. The federal prosecutors confronted him with the offshore wire transfers, the fraudulent death certificates, the forged executive orders, and the recorded testimonies of the corrupt foreign fixers who rolled over on him the second the State Department applied pressure. Faced with decades behind bars, Brent completely shattered. He took a federal plea deal to avoid spending the rest of his natural life in a maximum security cell. I sat in the cold, sterile gallery of the federal courthouse on the day of his sentencing. Brent was not wearing a custom-tailored corporate suit. He was wearing a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit. His hands and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains. He looked incredibly small, weak, and entirely defeated. The federal judge looked down from the high wooden bench with absolute contempt. She told Brent that his crimes were an astonishing display of sociopathic greed and a profound insult to the very concept of family. She sentenced him to 15 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. When the bailiffs grabbed his arms to lead him away, he turned and looked at me one final time. His eyes were wide, filled with a pathetic, begging desperation. He wanted me to save him. He wanted the soft, forgiving father to stand up and beg the court for mercy. I did not move a single muscle. I looked back at him with absolute cold clarity. I realized in that quiet moment that the son I had loved so deeply had died a long time ago. The terrified man shuffling out of the courtroom in chains was just a stranger finally facing the brutal consequences of his own actions. While the criminal courts handled my son, I focused all my energy on restoring the true heartbeat of Caldwell Commercial Contracting. The morning after the country club sting, I walked onto the concrete floor of my main warehouse right at 6 o'clock. The massive steel rolling doors were wide open. The morning sun was pouring in over the fleet of white service trucks. I called my general foreman, David Miller, directly into my office. David was the man Brent had cowardly fired through an email just 2 weeks prior. When David walked through the door, his eyes were red and his rough, calloused hands were shaking. I did not offer him a generic apology. I offered him the keys to the executive management office. I promoted him to vice president of operations on the spot with a massive raise and full back pay. We spent the next 3 days auditing the entire payroll. We identified the few middle managers who had eagerly collaborated with Brent's rapid liquidation plans, and we fired them immediately. We gathered the remaining crews, the loyal electricians, and hard-working apprentices who formed the absolute backbone of my business. I stood on the back of a flatbed truck and told them the honest truth. I told them the company was secure, the contracts were safe, and their families were protected. The cheer that erupted in that warehouse was loud enough to shake the steel rafters. Today, the business is running smoother and more profitably than it ever has in 40 years. My greatest personal victory, however, was securing a safe and independent future for Sarah. My daughter-in-law had lived in a state of quiet, suffocating terror for years, trapped in a marriage with a calculating monster. She was the brave whistleblower who handed me the digital keys to my son's destruction. I promised her I would protect her from the fallout, and I kept my word. I unleashed Harrison Cole on the family courts. Harrison, acting as Sarah's personal divorce attorney, absolutely decimated the marital assets. Since Brent was incarcerated for massive financial fraud, the judge easily granted a highly expedited divorce. All of the remaining legitimate funds in their joint accounts were awarded entirely to Sarah. But I knew that was not enough to guarantee her long-term peace of mind. I quietly purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a safe, quiet neighborhood on the other side of the county and put the deed entirely in her name. I set up a secure financial trust to ensure she would never have to worry about paying a mortgage or keeping the lights on. Sarah visits me every single Sunday afternoon. We sit on this cedar deck, drink sweet tea, and watch the sun go down. She is healing. Her smile is bright and genuine again. She has become the daughter I always wanted, and protecting her has brought a profound sense of purpose back into my life. I take a slow sip of my hot coffee and watch a red-tailed hawk circle above the tall pine trees at the edge of my property. I have had a lot of time to reflect on the nature of systemic karma. People often say that money changes a person. I strongly disagree. I have learned the hard way that money does not change anyone. It simply acts as a powerful magnifying glass. It strips away the polite social masks and reveals the absolute core of who a person truly is. Money revealed that my son was a hollow, greedy predator, willing to sell his own flesh and blood for a fast payout. But it also revealed the enduring loyalty of my hard-working crews, the immense bravery of my daughter-in-law, and the unbreakable strength of my own foundation. Brent believed that if he shouted loud enough, if he hired enough foreign fixers, and wore expensive enough suits, he could rewrite reality. He believed his loud, aggressive lies would drown out the simple facts. But truth operates on a completely different frequency. Truth is patient. Truth is incredibly quiet. It does not need to scream or put on a grand theatrical performance at a luxury country club. Truth simply waits in the shadows, methodically gathering strength, building an undeniable current until it is ready to flip the main breaker and shatter the loudest lies into 1,000,000 pieces. The blueprint of the universe is designed to expose the rot in the foundation. Systemic karma is not a myth. It is a fundamental law of engineering. If you build your life on a corrupt structure, it will inevitably collapse and bury you in the rubble. Revenge didn't make me whole, but justice did. I did not find peace by destroying my son out of blind, furious anger. I found peace by methodically restoring the natural order of my life. I found peace by protecting the innocent people who relied on me by rewarding genuine loyalty, and by allowing the legal system to permanently remove a dangerous threat from society. Vengeance is a wild, uncontrollable fire that burns down your own house just to catch a rat. Justice is a cold, solid concrete foundation that allows you to rebuild your life stronger than it ever was before. If this story touched your heart today and reminded you that the truth always finds a beautiful way to blossom through the darkest dirt, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our upcoming life stories. We are building a strong community of people who understand the value of honest work, fierce loyalty, and unwavering integrity. I want to know exactly who is standing shoulder to shoulder with me in this community. Let's see exactly how far our journey has traveled today. Please write down in the comments below which beautiful city you are watching from and exactly what time it is right now. Are you drinking your morning coffee on a quiet porch like me, or are you unwinding after a long, hard shift at work? Your stories and your presence mean the absolute world to this old contractor. I look forward to meeting every single one of you in the comments below. Until next time, stay strong, protect your foundation, and always keep moving forward. With all my love and deepest respect.